Likutey Halakhot. Rebbe Noson, follower of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. On Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. Laws of Tzitzit. Law 1. Tzitzit, made of wool or linen, fulfill the requirement of all types of garments, except wool for linen and linen for wool, nowadays, that we lack tekelet, because it is kilayim. Some say that one should not make tzitzit of linen at all, and this is the custom, Orach Chaim 9:2. See Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 29. One must take great care to guard one's clothes from stains and filth, and to keep them clean. As written, at all times, your clothes should be white. Ecclesiastes 9:8. Because clothes correspond to Malkut, as in the King of Glory, Psalms 24:7, and otherwise. The divine presence is in the category of, why are your clothes red? Isaiah 63:2, corresponding to menstrual blood. This corresponds to the imperfection of sins which come from the 365 sinews, which can be rectified only by tikkun haklali, the general rectification of the covenant, as in, as an eagle, he arouses his nest. Deuteronomy 32:11. This arouses the mind, from which whiteness is drawn into all the 365 sinews to cleanse the sins, as in, if your sins will be as red thread, they will become as white as snow. If they are red as crimson, they will become as wool. Isaiah 1:18, corresponding to, a tuft of red wool cleansed the sins. Yoma 39a. This corresponds to tzitzit. In principle, one must be very careful to protect one's clothes from the forces of evil. They are always trying to attach themselves to clothes. As our sages said, the wearing out of rabbis' clothes is their doing brachot 6b. Clothes are the lowest and outermost level of holiness, and that is where the forces of evil tend to attach themselves, and therefore all the imperfections of all the sins are evident and registered in clothing. But the opposite is also true, and all mitzvot are also registered in clothes. This is because with one's mitzvot, one creates for oneself a rabbinical garment, garments and coverings for the soul, so that the forces of evil will not attach themselves to it. When the clothes are clean, they are a potent protection, as explained elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 127, and therefore we must carefully guard our clothing. This is why the Torah commanded us regarding tzitzit, which are connected with clothes. Tzitzit are a protection for the clothing, so that the forces of evil will not attach themselves to them, which constitutes a protection for the entire Torah, both positive and negative commandments, since everything is registered in them. This is the meaning of the verse. You shall see it and remember all of God's commandments. Numbers 15:39. One elevates the mind with the tzitzit, and whiteness is then drawn into all of the 365 sinews, as in, at all times your clothes should be clean. Ecclesiastes 9:8, your sinews, as in the lesson. Tzitzit represent the tikkun haklali, as in, as an eagle, he rouses his nest. Deuteronomy 32:11, an eagle represents the spirit, which corresponds to tzitzit, as in, from the four winds, come, O Spirit. Ezekiel 37:9, which corresponds to the four tzitzit, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1:8. This is why the Rebbe says that tzitzit are a protection from sexual immorality. This is why our sages said, at all times, your clothing should be clean. This is the tzitzit, Shabbat 153a. Furthermore, the wings corners of the tzitzit correspond to wings of an eagle, as in, I carried you on the wings of an eagle. Exodus 19:4, which arouse the mind, and draw whiteness into all the 365 sinews. And this is why there are 32 threads in the Tzitzit, representing the evoking of whiteness drawn from the heart Lamed Beit, that is, 32 into all the 365 sinews. For all the sinews are dependent upon the heart and are nourished from it. By thus elevating the mind, whiteness is drawn from it to the heart, where the blood disintegrates and is transformed into milk. Bekorot 6b. This is because the heart represents, Bina is the heart. Tikuni Zohar 17a, which is, Bina is mother. Proverbs 2. 3 represented by the chest, from where whiteness comes, as in, blood disintegrates and is transformed into milk. This is why tzitzit are specifically white threads, thus creating white clothes, represented by the white talit. This corresponds to, if they are red as crimson, they will become as white as wool. Isaiah 1:18 as wool, representing the woolen tzitzit. And tekelet represents the blood that disintegrates and is transformed into milk. Techelet is a mixture of black and white, and black represents menstrual blood. As our sages said, black is red. Nida 20a. Tekelet represents that the blood has already been disintegrated and the black has transformed into white. This is the meaning of tzitzit, of wool and linen. Clothes represent the malchut, which is constructed and rectified mainly by loving kindness and judgment. Thus, tzitzit are made of wool and linen, for wool corresponds to loving kindness, as in, a tuft of red wool cleansed the sins, and linen corresponds to harsh judgments, as written, Gabriel was wearing linen, Ezekiel 9:3. Therefore, whenever the Torah mentions clothes, it usually refers to wool and linen, Menachot 39b. For clothing representing malchut are made and rectified mainly by wool and linen, which are loving kindness and judgments. This is the meaning of the prohibition to wear wool and linen together. The rectification is mainly when there is harmony and peace, when there is power to ameliorate the judgments and transform them into loving kindness, as in, blood disintegrates. This transforms them into dat, intellect. As the Rebbe said, that peace is dependent upon dat, which represents the merging of two opposites, which are loving kindness and harsh judgments. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 55. Through which clothes, representing the malchut, are made and rectified. This is accomplished by means of the tzitzit, which elevate the mind and evoke whiteness into the sinews to ameliorate the harsh judgments, mainly by the tekelet, for the main power of amelioration is with the tekelet. This is because they must be ameliorated at their source, represented by tekelet, which represents the throne of judgment, which is where they must be ameliorated, and which itself is represented by tchelet, which is the merging of black and white, which is harmony and peace between loving kindness and judgment. Thus, when the tzitzit have tchelet, there is harmony and peace between loving kindness and judgment, between wool and linen, thus perfecting the clothes. But when the tzitzit lack tchelet, it is forbidden to wear wool and linen together, for the forces of evil will attach themselves to the clothing, since their main power and nourishment is when instead of peace there is dispute, as the Rebbe says, that their main sustenance is from dispute, represented by the opposite of da'at, the opposite of peace. This is why sha'atnez is forbidden but permissible with tzitzit. And this is only when there is techelet, which represents harmony. Only then is sha'atnez permissible in tzitzit. But nowadays, when we have no techelet, for we lack the power today in the exile to transform the harsh judgments into loving kindness in order to whiten the redness. Our tzitzit are only white, representing protection from the forces of evil. Therefore, without techelet, sha'atnez is prohibited today in tzitzit. We lack the power to harmonize and make peace because we lack techelet, since we are in exile, and therefore our tzitzit are only wool, as the cited halakha concludes Orach Chaim 9:2. We must suffice ourselves with extracting ourselves from the forces of evil and drawing whiteness upon ourselves to prevent their attaching themselves to us. We still lack the power to transform the harsh judgments into loving kindness, for linen tzitzit are used only with tchelet when there is harmony and peace. This is represented by the 5 double knots in the tzitzit, which correspond to the 5 loving kindnesses and 5 harsh judgments, from which garments corresponding to Malkut are made. From all the above, we see that tzitzit correspond to the Tikkun Haklali, representing the guarding of the covenant, as the Rebbe also says elsewhere, that tzitzit guard against sexual immorality. This is why the tzitzit are braided 39 times, that is, 7 plus 8 plus 11 plus 13, which corresponds to the guarding of the covenant, represented by the letter Vav, which represents additional holiness, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 2, 11, which is why the verse says, regarding tzitzit, "You shall be holy to your God." Numbers 15:40. The Vav corresponds to the 39 lights, as the Rebbe says there, represented by the 39 braids, while the 13 braids correspond to the individual letters of VA, V numerically 13, and the length should be 12 finger breadths, alluding to that by having attained the Tikkun Haklali, one's soul is absorbed within the 12 tribes of God, which takes place through the Tikkun Haklali, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 36. And through tzitzit, which rectify the garments, corresponding to the general rectification, speech is permissible, and then one is able to speak acceptable words. This is why we usually wrap ourselves in tzitzit for prayer, and why God taught Moses the order of prayer wrapped in tzitzit, as our sages said. From here, we learn that God wrapped himself in a talit and taught Moses the 13 attributes, Rosh Hashanah 17b. The 13 attributes correspond to the rectifications of the beard, corresponding to wool, as in, I called out from the Maitzar, representing a talit of zemer. This is the meaning of the prayer of the pauper when he wraps and pours out his speech before God. Psalms 102:1. By wrapping himself in tzitzit, which is the garment of the divine presence, which is poor in the exile, as stated in the Holy Zohar, one is able to pour out one's speech before God in prayer, for that is how one becomes able to speak. This is why we must be very careful that the clothes should be clean during prayers, for clean clothes correspond to the Tikkun Haklali, and then one becomes able to speak acceptable words. This is the meaning of what is written in the holy literature, that the prayer of a person wearing shatnez does not ascend. For shatnez represents an imperfection in clothing, and then one is unable to speak acceptable words. Law 2. The meaning of tzitzit can be explained according to the Rebbe's teaching in Likutey Halakhot, Part 2, 12. Where is the lamb for the offering? Study there well. Section 1. In some, even spiritually filthy places and idolatrous temples also receive sustenance from the Creator. Although His glory is removed from there, as in, I shall not give my glory to another, Isaiah 42:8, nevertheless, they receive sustenance from the unspoken saying, which is Breshit, which is the supernal glory, which is hidden and shrouded to the ultimate degree of concealment. From there, they receive their sustenance. Thus, when a person falls into these places and then begins to search and seek for the place of his glory, this itself is his repentance and rectification. He thereby returns and ascends to the supernal glory, corresponding to where is the place of his glory, the source from where these places receive sustenance, from the depth of concealment. This person is now returning to bind himself to this holiness and to receive sustenance from there, and he thereby ascends. Study there well in the lesson. This is considered a burnt offering that atones for fantasies of the heart, which correspond to "My heart is dizzy," Psalms 38:11, through the klipa of Noga. And by means of "Where is the lamb for the offering?" that is, by searching and seeking in those places, one brings about a rectification and atonement, which creates a burnt offering, as in, "Where is the lamb for the offering?" This corresponds to "created a goat Tikuni Zohar, number 2, and which is the lamb for the offering that is created by Breshit, an unspoken saying represented by where. Study all this there well. Section 2. This corresponds to Tzitzit, which are the rectification of clothing, a protection from the forces of evil. Clothing represents glory, as Rabbi Yochanan called his garments glory, Shabbat 113a, and, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 2. All the glory of all the 10 sayings receive from the supernal saying, which is Breshit, an unspoken saying, from where sustenance is drawn even to those lowly places. That is why garments, corresponding to glory honor, are rectified by Tzitzit, which correspond to the supernal glory, to Breshit, an unspoken saying, represented by Tzitzit of sheep's wool, which comes from "Where is the lamb for the offering?" Sheep's and lamb's wool come from a very exalted level, as stated in Kabbalistic texts, in reference to "the hair on his head is like clean wool," Daniel 7:9, which corresponds to where? This is the source of Tzitzit made of wool, which corresponds to hairs, to the hair on his head. In other words, Tzitzit correspond to the supernal saying, which corresponds to the unspoken saying, which is why their spiritual light is only like hairs, which are very narrow, and their illumination is extremely constricted, as the unspoken saying. The Tzitzit rectify the garments of honor, because all glory and honor come from there. They also protect from the forces of evil and rectify the fantasies of the heart, as written, "You shall see it, and not stray after your hearts." Numbers 15:39. This is because the fantasies of the heart are rectified mainly by where, which is their source of sustenance and rectification. This is why Tzitzit correspond to "Where is the lamb for the offering?" This also explains the verse, "You shall see it and remember all of God's commandments." All of the commandments are dependent upon this, since the Tzitzit correspond to the supernal saying of Breshit, which constitutes all of the sayings, which is the totality of the entire Torah. This is represented by the Tzitzit surrounding the person on 4 sides in order to rectify. Noga surrounds him, as the Rebbe mentions, and Tzitzit themselves correspond to the klipa of Noga. The fact that the Tzitzit are at the 4 corners to wear, for when a person falls into these lowly places and then seeks and searches for where, this itself is his rectification. This corresponds to the 4 corners of the Tzitzit, in that one seeks and searches in every corner of the 4 corners of the world. Where is the place of his glory? For the Tzitzit correspond to where, which itself is the person's rectification. This is the illusion of the Tzitzit at the 4 corners. Wherever one turns, one can find God through the Tzitzit, which correspond to where, for where, is one's rectification, and in this way itself one finds God. Section 3. This is why it is permitted to enter the toilet with Tzitzit Orach Chaim 21:3, since his kingship rules over everything, Psalms 103:19. As said, the Tzitzit correspond to the supernal glory, to where, from which the filthy places are sustained. This is why they are subdued to it by means of the Tzitzit, which are assigned to remember the Creator, and that his kingship rules even over those places, for they have no life energy without him. That is why we seek and search in all corners, where is his glory, which itself corresponds to Tzitzit, to Breshit, an unspoken saying, which is their source of sustenance. Hence they thereby return to bind themselves in the essence of holiness, which is their source of sustenance, which is itself their subdual. Since they are nourished only from the complete concealment and disappearance of the holiness, as soon as they become aware of the presence of holiness and seek and search for where, they immediately return to holiness and are subdued. This explains the connection between his kingship rules over everything and the permissibility to enter the toilet with tzitzit, for these places are nourished by the tzitzit. Therefore, one may enter the toilet wearing tzitzit, for this itself subdues these places, for his kingship rules over everything. Therefore, the tzitzit have no inherent holiness, because they correspond to the unspoken saying, where holiness is concealed and hidden. Section 4. This corresponds to tzitzit of wool and linen, which are the archetypal tzitzit. Wool corresponds to where is the lamb for the offering. For sheep's wool represents a very exalted level, whereas linen is the very opposite, representing a very lowly level, as we find that Cain brought a lowly offering. Specifically, flaxseed, see Rashi on Genesis 4:3, and Midrash Tanchuma, there, for this very reason. Tzitzit are made from linen as well. Specifically in linen representing the lowest level from where the forces of evil, represented by Cain, draw sustenance, is clothed a very sublime nourishment from the highest level, corresponding to the unspoken saying. Hence, even linen is nourished by wool, which corresponds to the unspoken saying, and therefore, tzitzit are made from linen as well, for they correspond to the unspoken saying. This corresponds to the prohibition to wear sha'atnez, wool, and linen together. Though actually, even linen, from where the forces of evil draw sustenance, receives nourishment from wool, nevertheless, the forces of evil receive mainly from the concealment and disappearance, in that the holiness disappears and is concealed within the unspoken saying. However, one must not uncover this hidden holiness so that the forces of evil will not be able to draw too much sustenance from there. Therefore, it is forbidden to combine wool and linen, for the sustenance that linen receives from wool must remain hidden and concealed. But in tzitzit they may be worn together, for on the contrary, the tzitzit subdue the forces of evil and reveal the holiness, revealing that even the forces of evil are sustained from a very exalted place. Therefore, combining wool and linen in tzitzit is permitted, since in truth they are identical. Both are sustained by the unspoken saying, represented by tzitzit. Only when there are no tzitzit and the forces of evil are not subdued, but still wield power, wool and linen should not be combined, so as not to over-empower them. Their existence must remain as an unspoken saying, meaning that wool, which corresponds to wear, must be sealed, hidden, and concealed from linen, from which the forces of evil are sustained. In the context of tzitzit, though, when these forces are subdued, linen can then be combined with wool, for they are actually in the same category. Section 5. This corresponds to wrapping oneself in the talit before Yom Kippur, while it is still day Orach Chaim, 18:1. The atonement of Yom Kippur corresponds to tzitzit, which correspond to where is the place of his glory, which we recite on Yom Kippur several times. This is because Yom Kippur corresponds to Keter, to where, to Breshit, an unspoken saying, which constitutes all of the 10 sayings, for Yom Kippur constitutes all the 10 days of repentance, which correspond to the 10 sayings. Where itself represents the repentance and atonement of Yom Kippur, for that is how one exits and ascends from all the forces of evil, and all sins are atoned, as in, where is the lamb for the offering, which is revealed on Yom Kippur, for on this day Isaac's ashes, corresponding to where is the lamb for the offering, appear before God. This is why we wrap ourselves in tzitzit for the entire Yom Kippur, since the very day corresponds to tzitzit, which correspond to where is the lamb for the offering. This is represented by the Tzitzit of goodwill, in which God wrapped himself and recited the 13 attributes of compassion before Moses' Rosh Hashanah. 17b. For Tzitzit correspond to where, which is the source of compassion, goodwill, and atonement, as brought. Section 6. This corresponds to the ritual obligation of reciting the section of Tzitzit in the Kriyat Shema, and of holding the Tzitzit while we recite it, Orach Chaim 24:2. The essence of reciting the Shema is to acknowledge and reveal the glory of His kingship. We begin with, Hear, O Israel, concluding with 1, with which we declare Him King above, below, and to the 4 directions, representing the entire earth is filled with His glory. Isaiah 6:3. We extend the pronunciation of the Dalet so that it does not sound like a resh, for I will not give my glory to another. Isaiah 42:8, 48:11. And once we have revealed that God is one and no other, the question arises from where do idolatrous temples and similar places get their sustenance? Therefore we immediately say, May the name of His glorious kingdom be blessed forever, meaning that His kingship rules over everything, and His glory is blessed even in the lowest levels of the forces of evil. However, they only receive from the unspoken saying, which is why we recite this silently, for it is a very awesome secret that should not be delved into too much, certainly not spoken about, for it is extremely hidden and concealed, as the Rebbe says. This is the meaning of a princess who smelled peasants' food. If she speaks up, she will be disgraced. If she does not speak up. Pesakim 56a. One has sensed sublime holiness in these places, represented by peasants' food, which is fragrant food, but it comes from lowly people. If she speaks up, she will be disgraced. If she does not speak up, she will be pained. One cannot speak about it, for it is certainly a disgrace to say that there is holiness in these places, but if one does not speak about it, there is pain, for they are indeed nourished from holiness. Therefore, the food was brought to the princess in secrecy, implicitly revealing that they too are nourished by God, only that it is a secret, an unspoken saying. This is why we silently recite, Blessed is the name of His glorious kingdom forever, so that these forces do not overwhelm us. In fact, the very fact that we acknowledge that they are nourished by God is their subdual. Therefore, we must be on guard that they not overpower us, since this is their subdual, as brought, Blessed is the name of His glorious kingdom forever, corresponds to the Klipa of Noga. And therefore, on Yom Kippur, Blessed is the name of His glorious kingdom forever, is recited out loud, for then where is revealed, and they are truly subdued, for they are granted power throughout the year, except for on Yom Kippur. Then all sins are atoned, and all forces of evil are banished, and therefore we declare out loud, Blessed is the name of His glorious kingdom forever, stating that His holiness is blessed everywhere, even in the realm of evil. That too is nourished by God. On Yom Kippur it is no disgrace at all, since they are now subdued. Throughout the year it is somewhat disgraceful to speak about this, but now that they are subdued, we declare out loud, Blessed is the name of His glorious kingdom forever, that His glory is blessed even there. Therefore, Tzitzit is connected with Kriyat Shema, since all this corresponds to Tzitzit. Law 3. Tzitzit can be understood with Lesson 1 in Likutey Halakhot Part 2. Study the entire lesson there from beginning to end. Here is a summary of some of the principles emerging from this lesson. A Jewish person was created to have rule over the angels, but one must have the power to maintain this rule, so that the angels do not become jealous and try to oust him. To avoid this, one must hold on to the throne of glory, which corresponds to roots of Jewish souls, as in holding onto the front of the throne, Job 26:9. This refers mainly to the renowned souls, which are the main roots of Jewish souls. However, there are some who are falsely renowned, whose main renown is solely a result of audacity. To overcome this, one needs to rebuild Jerusalem, meaning to rectify the reverence of the heart to perfection. This is accomplished by rectifying the three main passions: money, food, and sexual lust, which correspond to the three posts of the night. All of these three passions ruin the reverence of the heart. They are rectified by means of the intellect that is evoked on the three festivals. For with this intellect, we are able to rectify and exit the imperfection of these three passions, which corresponds to evoking the Moed, people of renown, number 16. 2. For these three passions correspond to the evoking the Moed, people of renown. And by rectifying the three passions through the three festivals, which perfects the reverence of the heart, an angel which transmits prophecy is created, as in, the angel that redeems me from all evil, by means of which we attain prayer, which is redeemed from exile, and one attains perfect prayer, which corresponds to the word of God. Then one can attain healing without doctors, but be healed of all maladies simply by God's word alone, even through bread and water. This corresponds to the spark of the Messiah. However, there are three counter-services that ruin the service of prayer: idolatry, which is an imperfection of faith; sexual immorality; and bloodshed, that is, scorning people, which transgresses. Do not scorn any person. Avot 4:3. By cleansing oneself of these three counter-services, one attains prayer, and then all the angels and stars are under one's dominion. Through this, one is able to hold on to the root of Jewish souls that emerge from the throne of glory, and when one holds on to the throne of glory, one is able to make Rosh Hashanah. Speaking of another person corresponds to Rosh Hashanah, which is the day of judgment, for one is judging the other person. One must take great care to avoid this, for judgment is God's. Only He can judge us, for He judges everyone favorably. As our sages said, do not judge another person until you have been in his place. Avot 2. And who can be in another's place other than God alone? Who is the place of the world, and the world is not his place? Every single individual has a place with God, and therefore only He is able to judge the world favorably, for He is filled with compassion. We see His compassion in instituting Rosh Hashanah, the day of judgment, on Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, when He Himself has regret, so to speak, and says, "Bring an atonement for me, for having diminished the moon." Thus, we have a precedent to come before Him with our sins and express regret for them. This is the meaning of "Sanctity beautifies your temple, O God, for length of days." Psalms 95:5. God is filled with compassion, for He is the place of the world and knows the place of each and every individual. Though we find specific places where the divine presence rested, such as the temple, this does not mean that His godliness was limited there. As Solomon declared, "Indeed, the heavens and the heavens cannot contain you." 1 Kings 8:23. But only because there were beautiful things there, such as images of creation and of the Garden of Eden. Therefore, He drew His holiness into the temple. However, the world is not His place, but rather He is the place of the world, and therefore He is able to make Rosh Hashanah, the day of judgment, for He fulfills, "Do not judge another until you have been in his place." This is the meaning of "Sanctity beautifies your temple." He only drew His sanctity into the temple because there were beautiful things there, but He is the place of the world, and not vice versa. Therefore, O God, for length of days, He is able to make Rosh Hashanah, which is considered one long day, and anyone who holds onto the throne of glory, the root of souls, is also in the category of the place of the world, as in, He will bequeath them a throne of glory, for God's are the pillars of the earth, upon which He has established the world. 1 Samuel 2:8. Through the throne of glory, one becomes the place of the world, and one is thus able to make Rosh Hashanah. Study all this there well. Section 1. This corresponds to Tzitzit. Tzitzit correspond to the throne of glory, the root of souls, as our sages said. Tekelet resembles the sea. The sea resembles the throne of glory. Menachot 43b. Jewish souls, the throne of glory, correspond to the divine garments, for the throne of glory and the divine garments are the same concept as Rabbi Yochanan called his garments, his honor, Shabbat 1:13a. This is why the throne of glory is the seat of his glory, in that it is a covering for his glory, which is represented by the totality of all worlds, which are comprised within Jewish souls, representing the divine garments which correspond to the throne of glory. Therefore, Tzitzit constitute the entire Torah as written, so that you remember and fulfill all of my commandments. Numbers 15:40. All of the 613 commandments are comprised within it, as our sages said, Menachot 43b, for the essence of the entire Torah is so that by fulfilling all of the commandments, we will be able to approach the throne of glory, that is, to hold onto the throne of glory, so that we will have dominion over the angels. This is comprised within the mitzvah of Tzitzit, which is the rabbinical garment, corresponding to the divine garments, corresponding to the throne of glory. Therefore, our daily service begins every day with Tzitzit, which we fulfill immediately upon arising in the morning. Similarly, we begin training a child with Tzitzit. We teach a child about Tzitzit before other practical commandments. This is because the very purpose of beginning to serve God is in order to reach the ultimate goal, which is to have dominion over the angels, which is the purpose for which man was created. And therefore we begin with Tzitzit, by means of which we are able to hold onto the throne of glory. This is represented by the Tzitzit, as in holding onto the front of the throne, Job 26:9, by means of which we have the power to devote ourselves to God's service until we are able to attain dominion over the angels. For once we are holding onto the throne of glory through the Tzitzit, they are unable to oust us. Section 2. Holding onto the throne of glory requires guarding the reverence of the heart, represented by the construction of Jerusalem. This is accomplished by rectifying the three passions, which correspond to the three posts of the night that are rectified by the intellect that is evoked on the three festivals. This corresponds to Tzitzit, which correspond to the rectification of the reverence of the heart, as in, so that you will not stray after your hearts. Numbers 15:39. This is represented by the Lamed Beit, that is, 32 strands of the Tzitzit. For the Tzitzit rectify the reverence of the heart, since one is protected from the imperfection of the passions by the Tzitzit, as in, so that you will not stray after your hearts. This protects the reverence of the heart. For the strands of the Tzitzit come from the intellect of the three festivals to rectify the passions that are connected with the heart. Therefore, Tzitzit are worn only during the day and not at night. Menachot 43a. Since the night corresponds to darkness, to the imperfection of the three passions, which correspond to the three posts of the night. The intellect of the three festivals must be evoked each and every day in order to rectify the three posts of the night, corresponding to the three passions. This is represented by the light of day, corresponding to the light of intellect that is evoked every day from the three festivals. This is because the festivals are called Yom Tov, good days, and the light of day is called good, as in, God saw that the light was good. Genesis 1:4. Light corresponds to loving kindness, which corresponds to the intellect that is evoked from the three festivals, from the good days that rectify the three passions, by means of which daylight shines and the darkness of night, corresponding to the three passions, is banished. This can be attained every day through Torah study at night, that is, by rising at midnight for Torah study. Everyone should rise at midnight to break the three posts of the night, for midnight is the middle point of the night, the darkest point of night. And when one breaks the night and rises at midnight, one thereby breaks and banishes all the three posts of the night, which correspond to the three passions. Therefore, We study Torah then in order to evoke the intellect to rectify the three passions. This is why we also mourn the destruction of the temple at midnight. The intellect is drawn mainly from the temple, as our sages said. Whoever possesses intellect is as if the temple were constructed in his lifetime. Brachot 33a, as mentioned several times by the Rebbe. Therefore, the Torah requires us to make a pilgrimage to the temple for the three festivals in order to draw intellect from there to rectify the three passions. And therefore, at midnight, which constitutes the entire night, we study Torah in order to rectify the three passions which correspond to the three posts of the night. This is why we devote ourselves at this time to the construction of the temple, for by mourning over its destruction, we will have the privilege of seeing its rebuilding, as our sages said, Ta'anit 30b. Hence, by mourning the destruction of the temple, we are actually involved in building it, and thereby evoke the intellect to rectify the three posts of the night which correspond to the three passions. We thereby, in the morning, attain the light of day, which is drawn from the intellect that is evoked every day from the three festivals, as in, a thread of loving kindness will be drawn during the day upon anyone who studies Torah at night, Hagigah 12b. Loving kindness is the intellect, as mentioned many times elsewhere, for we thereby attain the light of day in the morning, which is the light of the intellect that is evoked from the good day, from the three festivals, by rising at midnight and breaking the three posts of the night, which correspond to the three passions. Therefore, we evoke this light of the intellect first thing in the morning with the threads of the Tzitzit, which correspond to threads of loving kindness, which is evoked in the morning by breaking the night with Torah study at night, which corresponds to the three passions. By studying Torah at night in order to evoke the intellect of the temple, we thereby attain in the morning the thread of loving kindness, represented by the strands of the Tzitzit, by means of which we receive the light of the intellect from the three festivals. The Tzitzit correspond to the festivals, as in, righteousness will go before you, Psalms 85:14, which refers to the three festivals, at which time we go up in pilgrimage to the temple, as written 3 times a year, Exodus 23:17. This corresponds to, righteousness will go before you and put its feet upon the path as brought elsewhere. This corresponds to Tzitzit, as in, I have donned tzedek and clothed me, Job 29:14, which corresponds to the 8 strands in each of the Tzitzit. Each strand must be twined, and twining requires at least 2 threads, as our sages derive from the verse, the corner, a twine. Numbers 15:38. Hence, there are 16 strands in each of the Tzitzit, 8 twined strands, corresponding to the 16 days of the 3 festivals. Pesach is 7 days, Shavuot is 1, and Sukkot is 8. As in, give a part for 7 and also for 8, Ecclesiastes 11:2, which our sages interpreted as referring to the festivals. Therefore, the essence of Tzitzit is 8 strands corresponding to the 8 days of Sukkot, which is the highest number of days among the festivals, and the 7 days of Pesach and the day of Shavuot are included within it. Sukkot is also the last of the 3 festivals, corresponding to Jacob, who constituted all the forefathers within himself. For the light of all 3 festivals is completed on Sukkot and constitutes them all. Therefore, there are 8 strands in the Tzitzit. Section 3. This corresponds to the Exodus from Egypt that is mentioned in the section of Tzitzit, which corresponds to the 3 festivals, which are all in commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt. The essence of the Exodus from Egypt corresponds to midnight, as in, around midnight I will go out into Egypt. Exodus 11:4. We break the 3 passions, which correspond to the darkness of night, and which are the essence of the exile in Egypt, which is the exile in the realm of the forces of evil, which overwhelm a person with the 3 passions. By breaking the night, by rising at midnight, one takes leave of the exile in Egypt, of the exile in the 3 passions, as in, around midnight I will go out into Egypt, and we attain the 3 festivals, which are a commemoration of the exodus from Egypt. We thereby attain the light of the Tzitzit, which are the garments that cover a person, protecting and guarding him from the three passions, which correspond to the imperfection of the garments, as in, "You were naked and bare," Ezekiel 16:7, which refers to the exile in Egypt. In other words, when one has fallen into the imperfection of the three passions, corresponding to the exile in Egypt, the soul is then naked, as in, "You were naked and bare," as in, it alone is his clothing, it is his garment for his skin, Exodus 22:26. This refers to Tzitzit and Tefillin, Tikkuni Zohar 100b, "With what will he lie in the exile," as stated in the Holy Zohar Tikkunim 142a through b. In other words, when one lies in exile, in the imperfection of the three passions, with what will he lie? In exile. Then one is naked and bare, for these three passions correspond to an imperfection of glory. Since glory corresponds to garments, as Rabbi Yochanan called his garments his honor, Shabbat 113a, these three passions are called people of renown, as explained in the lesson, and a name is the glory, as in, "Blessed is the name of glory," Psalm 72:19, and as in, "Give to God the glory of his name," Psalms 29:2. But these passions, imperfection, the name, and the honor, for they are called people of renown, since money is called glory, as written, "He made all this honor from what was our father's," Genesis 31:1, as in, "Rabbi Yehuda honored the wealthy," Eruvin 86a. Hence, the root of money is honor, as the Rebbe mentions elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 159. Furthermore, the passion for money, as well as the passion for sexual lust, imperfection, honor, for shame is only related to sexuality, Likutey Moharan 19:3, and the essence of honor is by guarding the covenant, as brought elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1:11. The passion for food also imperfections honor, as in the table of kings, the king of glory, as also brought elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1:67. Therefore they imperfection the garments, which correspond to glory and honor, and therefore, regarding the exile in Egypt, which corresponds to the three passions, the opposite of the three festivals, which correspond to the exodus from Egypt, the verse says, "You were naked and bare," as in, "With what will he lie in the exile?" Therefore, in the morning, when the light of day shines, corresponding to the light of the intellect of the three festivals, corresponding to the exodus from Egypt that shines every day, we then attain garments of holiness, which are the garments of the Tzitzit, which cover the imperfection of the passions, for they correspond to the light that is evoked on the three festivals. Section 4. By means of the three festivals which rectify the reverence of the heart, the angel which transmits prophecy is created, as in, "The angel that redeems me from all evil," by means of which we attain prayer, which is the Word of God. The three festivals, shining into prayer, corresponds to the three colors of the eye and the pupil. The three festivals correspond to the three forefathers, who correspond to the three colors of the eye. And prayer corresponds to the kingship of David, which is the fourth leg of the throne, which corresponds to the pupil, which itself corresponds to the redeeming angel that is evoked from the three festivals. This is because the angel corresponds to the divine presence, as the Rebbe says at the end of the lesson, which corresponds to the Malkut, and therefore prayer, which also corresponds to Malkut, is rectified mainly through this angel. This corresponds to the four Tzitzit, which correspond to the three colors and the pupil, as in, "You shall see it," which refers to Tzitzit. This is because the main illumination of the three festivals is the shining Malkut, represented by a Dalet, a 4, into the pupil. For the main ascendance of the Malkut is during the three festivals. As the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 30. This is represented in the 4 Tzitzit for the 3 festivals, which are the 3 colors of the eye that shine into the pupil. Evoke the 4 Tzitzit, which correspond to Malkut, represented by Dalet 4. Section 5. Therefore, prayer is rectified mainly by Tzitzit, for the Tzitzit are evoked from the 3 festivals that shine into the pupil, represented by prayer, as said, and therefore. Specifically, this is how one is able to hold on to the throne of glory, as explained in the lesson, the 3 colors and the pupil, which correspond to the 3 festivals that rectify prayer, which corresponds to the 4 Tzitzit, correspond to the 3 forefathers, and David, who correspond to the 4 feet of the throne, as our sages said. Therefore, that is how one is able to hold on to the throne of glory. Section 6. Tzitzit also rectify the 3 acts that ruin the service of prayer: idolatry, sexual immorality, and bloodshed, as our sages said, Lador Otam, Numbers 15:38. Referring to Tzitzit Lador Tam, for a pure generation, Tam of idolatry, Tam of sexual immorality, and Tam of bloodshed. See Tana Debe, Eliyahu Rabbah 26. This corresponds to, so that you shall not stray after your hearts, which refers to heresy, to idolatry, and after your eyes, which refers to sexual immorality, and hence, the Tzitzit protect from idolatry and sexual immorality. The Tzitzit, which are the rectification of garments, also protect from bloodshed, which is connected with garments, represented by the red talit mentioned in reference to Esau, who shed blood. As written about him, the first one came out red, completely like a mantle of hair. Genesis 25:25, upon which Rashi comments, like a talit. The Rebbe mentions this elsewhere, in a different context. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 8. Therefore, regarding one who imperfections the Tzitzit, the verse says, even in the corners of your garments were found the blood of the souls of innocent paupers. Jeremiah 2:34. As our sages say, Shabbat 32b. This is because the imperfection of the Tzitzit is an imperfection of the garments, corresponding to bloodshed, as in, why are your clothes red? Isaiah 63:2, as the Rebbe mentions elsewhere. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 8. Tzitzit, though, rectify garments, corresponding to a white talit, as opposed to Esau's red talit. Therefore, Tzitzit protect a person from bloodshed, since one will then not transgress on, do not scorn any person, Avot 4:3, which corresponds to bloodshed, as in, who is honored? He who honors others. Avot 4:1. Therefore, through Tzitzit, which are the main rectification of clothing, which represent glory and honor, one is honored, and one then certainly honors others and is protected from transgressing on. Do not scorn any person. Hence, Tzitzit protect a person from the 3 sins, for Tzitzit are the main rectification of prayer. Therefore, Tzitzit promote healing, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1:7, as alluded in, behold, your son Joseph has come to you. Genesis 48:2, which corresponds to Tzitzit, as brought in the pre-Orach Chaim, Tzitzit 4:4. This brings about, Israel gained strength. For through Tzitzit one attains prayer, which is the Word of God, and through the Word of God one attains healing from heaven, through all things in the world, even from bread and water, as in, He will bless your bread, and I will remove illness. Exodus 23:25, corresponding to, one can heal with anything except for idolatry, Pesachim 25a, as explained in the lesson. Section 7. Hence, the light from the 3 festivals is evoked by the Tzitzit to rectify the 3 traits, corresponding to the exodus from Egypt, through which we are able to attain prayer, the Word of God, by means of which we are able to hold onto the throne of glory, the roots of Jewish souls, represented by the Tzitzit. And upon being able to hold on to the throne of glory, one is then able to make Rosh Hashanah, which is the day of judgment, that is, to judge the entire world favorably with compassion. Just as God judges everyone with compassion, since He is the place of the world, and the world is not His place, as explained well in the lesson and mentioned above. This is the essence of the Tzitzit, which rectify the garments, enabling us to hold on to the throne of glory in order to judge the entire world favorably with compassion, because garments judge the person, as in, God reigns, He dons pride, Psalms 93:1. This verse refers to Rosh Hashanah, when God sits on His throne to judge the world, as written there, "Your throne was established of old," and, as brought in reference to Rosh Hashanah, the day of judgment, when God dons His garments of pride to judge the world. This is because garments correspond to judgments and themselves judge all people, as the Rebbe mentions elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 29, as in, I donned tzedek, and tzedek is the law of the Malkut. However, the intensity of the judgment of the garments would incinerate the world, for no one will be found righteous before you. Therefore, we must rectify the garments with the tzitzit, which correspond to the throne of glory, by means of which we enter the category of the place of the world. For whoever holds on to the throne of glory is in the category of the place of the world, as explained well in the lesson. Then, one is able to judge everyone favorably with compassion, as in, do not judge another until you reach his place, as when God dons His garments of glory on Rosh Hashanah and judges the world on that day, He judges the Jewish people with great compassion. This is because Rosh Hashanah is a great kindness, in that God set the day of judgment on the new moon, when He Himself says, "Bring an atonement for me," for He is the place of the world, and the world is not His place, and He knows the place of each and every individual, and therefore judges all of Israel with great compassion. This is represented by the tzitzit that we attach to the garments, through which we are able to hold onto the throne of glory, and then we are in the category of the place of the world, and are able to judge everyone favorably, as God does. This is because tzitzit represent the place of the world, for they hang from the four corners corresponding to the four corners of the world. In other words, all the four corners of the world, which constitute all the places of the entire world, come from tzitzit, which corresponds to the place of the world, for they correspond to the throne of glory. The essence of tzitzit is that they elevate, gather, and bind the place of each and every individual to beyond place, which is the place of the world, the root of the place of each and every individual. Therefore, we are able to judge everyone favorably, since we know each one's place. Section 8. In the Rebbe's awesome story of the 7 beggars, in the story of the 5th beggar who was hunchbacked, he speaks about the little that holds a lot. It is implied there that this concept is related to the concept of beyond place, though there are many levels of a little holding a lot, level beyond level. However, all littles that hold a lot are still within place, though approaching beyond place. But the highest level of a little that holds a lot is so close to beyond place that one completely leaves the realm of place and enters the realm of beyond place. In this way, one is able to reach the tree under which all beasts sheltered in its shade and in its branches. End quote. Daniel 4:9, which is completely beyond place. Study there the entire amazing and awesome story. Tzitzit correspond to a little that holds a lot, and thus elevate a person from the dimension of place to the dimension of beyond place, to the category of the throne of glory, to the place of the world, where everything is ameliorated with compassion, as in, I carried you on the wings of an eagle and brought you to me. Exodus 19:4. The wings of an eagle correspond to the wings, that is, corners, of the mitzvah tzitzit. See Tikkuni Zohar, 142a, as an eagle, he rouses his nest, resting upon his chicks, Deuteronomy 32:11, which we recite before wrapping ourselves in tzitzit. And by means of the wings of an eagle, of the wings of mitzvah, I brought you to me. God brought us near to him. From the category of place to the category of the place of the world, to beyond place. As our sages explain the verse, I carried you, as referring to the exodus from Egypt, for on that day they left Ramses and arrived at Sukkot, walking 120 kilometers in one day. This represents beyond place, as when the earth shrinks, as in he encountered the place, referring to Jacob. For he jumped over place and encountered this place on that day, for Jacob was able to rise to the dimension of beyond place. This is the meaning of the earth shrinking, and this is the meaning of I carried you. They were raised above place, and therefore they traveled from Ramses to Sukkot on one day. This is brought about by Tzitzit, as in, I carried you on the wings of an eagle and brought you, which refers to the wings of mitzvah. Section 9. Therefore, Tzitzit gathers in the exiled from the four corners of the earth, from all the places to which they were scattered. For each individual was exiled to a specific place on account of his place. For his place brought this upon him, as in, do not judge another person until you reach his place. God, though, who is the place of the world and knows the place of each and every individual, judges each one favorably. For he knows that his place caused him to act as he did. And when God wants to manifest his great compassion upon him, he raises him above that place into the dimension of beyond place, where everything is ameliorated and rectified. This corresponds to repentance, which preceded the world. For repentance corresponds to beyond place, to the throne of glory, which represents the place of the world, as in, great is repentance, which reaches the throne of glory Yoma, 86a. The place of each individual causes him to become distanced from God, for place represents the domain of the world of action, the domain of the constriction, where the forces of evil have their main attachment. As known, anyone seeking to come closer to God must always beseech him from whichever place he is in, binding and elevating that place to beyond place, to the place of the world, to God. Then one will be able to truly serve God without any place being able to obstruct him, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 33. Even someone who has fallen into a no-good place on account of his sins, even if he has fallen to a very low, material, and filthy place, he must nevertheless remember that God is the place of the world, in which there is place for each and every individual. Therefore, there is actually no such thing as falling at all, for one can return to God, the place of the world, from wherever one is, from wherever one has been exiled to, as in, you will seek God from there, Deuteronomy 4:29 from the place where one is, as the Baal Shem Tov said. This corresponds to Tzitzit, which correspond to beyond place, to the throne of glory, to the place of the world. Tzitzit at their root are in the dimension of beyond place, and therefore, even on earth, the Tzitzit are in the category of a little that holds a lot, as written. 10 men from all the nations of the world will grab onto the garment corner of a Jewish man and say, let us come with you, Zechariah 8:23, upon which our sages said, 700 people will hold onto each corner of the four corners of the Tzitzit Shabbat 32b. Hence, Tzitzit are in the category of a little that holds a lot, and therefore, specifically to the corner of the Tzitzit garment, which is in the category of a little that holds a lot, 700 people will be able to hold on. And therefore, specifically by this means will they say, let us come with you, come closer to God, for through the Tzitzit, the little that holds a lot, by holding on to them, one is able to rise from place to beyond place, by which means one comes closer to God, who is the place of the world, as in, I carried you on the wings of an eagle and brought you to me. Therefore the Tzitzit gather in the exiled from the four corners of the world, as in, bring us in peace from the four corners prayer preceding the recital of Kriyat Shema, which includes the section of Tzitzit, at which point we take hold of the Tzitzit. This is because the Tzitzit correspond to the throne of glory, to the place of the world, and judge everyone favorably, even those who have been banished to very far places on account of their sins. They elevate and gather all the exiled from their places of exile to beyond place, to the place of the world, where the place of each and every individual, including the exiled, is ameliorated and rectified, for everyone is judged there favorably. Section 10. This corresponds to the Exodus from Egypt, when God carried the people on the wings of eagles and brought them close to Him. That is, He elevated them beyond place, which is the essence of the Exodus from Egypt, leaving the narrows and the constraint, which correspond to place, which is the ultimate constriction, the place of narrows and constraint. Beyond place, there can be no narrows or constraint at all. Only below, within place, can there be narrows and constraint, and therefore all types of suffering are called distress. For the essence of suffering comes from the constriction represented by place, where there are narrows and constraint, which are the source of all suffering, for they all come from the constriction, which corresponds to judgments as known. Therefore, leaving distress and suffering is called expansion. As said, in distress you expanded for me, Psalms 4:2, and I called to God from the strait, He answered me from the expansion, Psalms 1:18-5. This is because the essence of salvation is by ameliorating the judgment, which is an expansion of the constriction, corresponding to leaving place, leaving the constriction to go beyond place, into expansion, where there can be no constraint at all, since there is no place there at all, since it is beyond place. This is the correspondence with the Exodus from Egypt, in that Egypt is called the nudity of the earth, Genesis 42:9, a very defiled place. Hence, Egypt is a place that causes a person to sin, and therefore is called Mitzrayim, symbolizing the narrows. For the further a place is from holiness, the more it is in the category of constriction, of place, of materiality. A place that has holiness is closer to being beyond place, to the place of the world, which is God, whereas a place that is very material is more constricted, for the further it is from the place of the world, the further it is from being a little that holds a lot, and is increasingly more limited within place and materiality, where narrows and constraint are most intensely found. This corresponds to Egypt, a defiled place, the nudity of the earth, and therefore the name Mitzrayim represents narrows and constraint. Therefore, when God took the people out of Egypt, He carried them on the wings of eagles from Ramses to Sukkot in one day, representing His elevating them beyond place, which is the essence of the Exodus from Egypt. By having elevated them beyond place, they were able to leave the exile in Egypt, which is the ultimate place that is delineated by boundaries and constrictions, the ultimate materiality. Specifically, in this way, they were brought close to God, as in, I carried you on the wings of eagles and brought you to me. This is because one comes closer to God mainly by leaving the dimension of place and entering the category of the throne of glory, the place of the world, which is beyond place, where all things are ameliorated and rectified. Section 11. This corresponds to the counting of the Omer, when we bring the barley offering on the second day of Pesach, and then begin counting 7 weeks, 49 days, in order to take leave of the defilement of Egypt. The raising of the barley offering to all 6 directions above, below, and to the 4 sides, which are the ultimate boundaries of place, corresponds to elevating and binding place, represented by the 6 directions, to God, to beyond place, to the place of the world. This is because barley represents the constriction of all judgments, as brought in Kabbalistic texts. This is why the offering is called an omer of barley, for an omer is a measurement and a constriction corresponding to place to constriction. By raising the omer of barley offering in the temple to the 6 directions, we thereby bind and elevate, place the 6 directions and all constrictions to the category of beyond space, which is actually the essence of all the offering services in the temple. This is because the temple is in the category of a little that holds a lot, which is rooted in beyond space. As our sages said, they stood densely but prostrated spaciously, and no one ever said to another, "This place is too crowded for me to stay," in Jerusalem Avot 5:5. This is because the land of Israel, Jerusalem, the temple, and the Holy of Holies, at which are all the 10 levels of holiness, are very close to beyond place, and therefore they are in the category of a little that holds a lot, and therefore there is no place in Jerusalem that is too crowded. And in the temple, which is very holy, the little that holds a lot was even greater, such that they stood densely but prostrated spaciously, and the place between the 2 poles of the ark were even more so, a little that holds a lot, for the entire Jewish people stood in that place. As our sages said on the verse, "Come here," Joshua 3:9, Genesis Rabbah 5:6, and upon which Rashi comments there, they all fit into the place between the 2 poles of the ark. This is one instance where a little held a lot. Section 12. The world was founded upon the foundation stone in the temple Yoma 54b, and the place of the entire world spread out from that point where the little that holds a lot was at its highest intensity, for it held within itself the place of the entire world. This was because the foundation stone approached the dimension of beyond place, from which the point of the foundation stone, the point of the place of the world, emerged, as in, "He established the earth upon them," 2 Samuel 2:8, which refers to the foundation stone, the foundation of the world. Therefore, when Jacob traveled to Charan, he encountered that place, which was at the point of the foundation stone, the Holy of Holies, as our sages said. The earth jumped to meet him, Sanhedrin 95a, because it was beyond place. 12 stones merged into one at that place when Jacob lay down there. Another example of a little that holds a lot, and hence the temple is in the dimension of beyond place, of a little that holds a lot. Therefore, the Sanhedrin, the rabbinical tribunal, sat in the temple and judged the entire world, for they were able to judge the entire world favorably, as they were commanded to do, as written, "The tribune shall save," Numbers 35:25, as our sages said, Pesakim 12a. Therefore, the main place of judgment is there, in the chamber of hewn stone, for there in the temple was it possible to rise to the place of the world by means of the point of the foundation stone, by means of which it was possible to judge everyone favorably. Therefore, the Torah commanded, "Do not sway from the word they will tell you," from that place, Deuteronomy 17:11, specifically from that place. For the place is the factor, as in, the place which God will choose, Deuteronomy 12:11. For specifically, this place was chosen by God, since it was close to beyond place, which is the main place of judgment. Only the one who is able to rise and bind himself to the place of the world is able to judge the world, for there everyone is judged favorably. This was specifically at the temple. Section 13. This corresponds to the sacrificial service. The dimension of place is due to a lack of knowledge, and the more knowledge one has, the closer one is to the dimension of beyond place, as can be understood from the Rebbe on the verse, "I have begotten you today," Likutey Moharan, Part 2, 61. Therefore, when a foolish spirit enters a person and he sins, as our sages said Sota 3b, on account of which he falls even deeper into material place, his rectification is in the temple by bringing an animal for a sacrifice. The animal, lacking knowledge, and thus corresponding to place, and to judgment and constriction which correspond to place, was elevated in the temple to beyond place, For in the temple it was possible to rise from the dimension of place to the dimension of beyond place. Therefore, the temple was higher than all lands, as written, "You shall stand up and go up to the place." Deuteronomy 17:17. For the temple corresponded to the place of the world, to beyond place. The place of all the lands was there, in the temple, for they all emerged from there, from the point of the foundation stone. For by perfecting one's knowledge, which is the essence of man, one is able to rise to the dimension of beyond place. Adam was created mainly from this place, from the place of the temple, from where he was brought into Gan Eden, in which stood the tree of life, which had food for all in its shade, and under its branches dwell. Daniel 4:9. This holy tree is beyond place, and through it one rises from place to the beyond place, as stated in the Rebbe's story. Therefore, all souls rise to the throne of glory, represented by the place of the world, via the tree of life. So, when Adam was created, he was at a high level, entering the Garden of Eden while alive, and had he not sinned, there would have been no death in the world, and he would have been able to rise to the throne of glory, which is beyond place, to the place of the world, during his life, via the tree of life that stood in there, in the garden. Hence, Adam was able to rise to beyond place, which is the essence, man, which is knowledge. But on account of his sin, man will not dwell in glory. He is compared to animals. Psalms 49:21. He was banished from the Garden of Eden and fell from this knowledge and thus into place, which is the essence of the animal, which lacks knowledge, which is the essence of the delineation of place. That is the source of all sins, for the place causes each person to sin. Each person must be tested and withstand the tests specifically in the place where he is. If he does not muster the strength to purify and sanctify his place and his level, wherever it is, he may come to sin via his place. Therefore, the main rectification is by repentance, which reaches the throne of glory, which corresponds to beyond place. This corresponds to the animal sacrifice service in the temple. Elevating the animal, which lacks knowledge, representing the dimension of place, to the dimension of beyond place, to the place of the world, to God, is the main rectification. The main rectification of a sacrifice is to rise from the category of animal to the category of man, as in, a man, when he sacrifices a sacrifice to God from the animal, Leviticus 1. Number 2, as brought elsewhere. In other words, to rise from the dimension of place to the dimension of beyond place, where all things are ameliorated and rectified. Section 14. But when a person sins, he falls below place, and he then has no place in the world at all, for place is too narrow for him. As written about Cain, "You have banished me today from the face of the earth, and I shall wander and roam upon earth." Genesis 4:14. For one then falls into constriction, corresponding to place, which is narrow and constraining. This corresponds to the exile in Egypt that was decreed for the sin of Adam. With his sin, he fell from one extreme to the other. Before he sinned, he was in the dimension of beyond place, in the category of the place of the world, and hence all places in the world were comprised within him. But now, after he sinned, he fell beneath place, and he had no place in the world at all, for it was now narrow and constraining for him. For in truth, man has no place in the world at all, for in essence, he is beyond place. And if he reaches and maintains himself at this level through his good deeds, he is then in the category of the place of the world, and the world is not his place. All places are then subjugated to him, and all places yearn to have him, for he is able to elevate all places to beyond place, which is the ultimate goal. However, when a person sins, then all places banish him, as in, "You have banished me," for he has no place there at all. But God sustains the person in the world with his compassion until he repents, which corresponds to beyond place, and then the person returns to his grandeur. This corresponds to our sage's teaching, I have never seen a fox doing business, yet they are sustained without suffering, while I, who was created to serve my Maker, but I have acted badly and therefore forfeited my sustenance. Kiddushin 82b. In other words, all animals and birds have a place in the world and find their sustenance without suffering. But man wanders about on earth and has great suffering and difficulty earning his living and finding a place in which to dwell, all on account of having acted badly, which causes place to be narrow for him. Section 15. Hence, the essence of the sacrifice in the temple is by elevating and raising the dimension of place to the dimension of beyond place, represented by the raising of the omer in the temple to the 6 directions. Barley is animal food, the lack of knowledge, corresponding to place, for barley represents all the constrictions, which is the essence of place. Therefore, by raising the omer of barley to all 6 directions in the temple simultaneously with the animal sacrifices that were brought at the same time, place is elevated to beyond place. And this is specifically how one takes leave of the defilement of Egypt. The essence of the filth of Egypt was due to the place, for Egypt was the place of greatest materiality, where materiality was the grossest and the lowest. Therefore, the very place of Egypt was defiled, and therefore it was called Mitzrayim, as said. But by elevating the omer, all places are elevated to beyond place, and thereby we take leave of the defilement of Egypt, which comes from the place. And this is specifically how one takes leave of the defilement of Egypt. The essence of the filth of Egypt was due to the place, for Egypt was the place of greatest materiality, where materiality was the grossest and the lowest. Therefore, the very place of Egypt was defiled, and therefore it was called Mitzrayim, as said. But by elevating the omer, all places are elevated to beyond place, and thereby we take leave of the defilement of Egypt, which comes from the place. This corresponds to the counting of the omer, the counting of the days, in order to take leave of the defilement of Egypt. All human actions are done in time and place, which is the main sphere of influence of the forces of evil. But God, who is beyond place, beyond time, and there, beyond place and time, everything is good, and evil has no power there at all, and all things are ameliorated. This is the meaning of the verse. If I ascend to the sky, there you are. If I lay my bed in the netherworld, here you are. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your countenance? Psalms 139:8. King David is here praising God's greatness by saying that there is no place to flee from God or to despair, for there is no place in which God is not, for he is the place of the world, and all the places in the world are with him. Therefore, he can be found in all the places in the world and in all the lowest levels, for place itself is from God, who is the place of the world and who sustains all the places and levels. Then he speaks of beyond time and says, "Your eyes saw me while I was an undeveloped fetus, and all my life story of days not yet created was written in your book, for it is all one for him. All created days are one for God, for he is beyond time, where all is one, a day that is endless, that is wholly good." This is Yom Kippur, for the Rebbe says that the day on which a person repents is beyond time, and that Yom Kippur is also beyond time. Sefer Hamidot, Repentance, number 1. This is the meaning of, it is all one for him, beyond time, where all days are one. This corresponds to Yom Kippur, which is beyond time. Repentance corresponds to beyond place, to the throne of glory, and is beyond time. Therefore, after the raising of the Omer, which represents elevating and binding the dimension of place to the dimension of beyond place, We then begin to count the days, for beyond time it is impossible to count. Therefore, when God created the world, He created place and time, and counted the days. As written, there was evening and there was morning. One day there was evening, a second day. Genesis 1:5-8. For it was impossible for the world to be created other than in time and place, represented by counting. For only in these dimensions is it possible to count, for beyond time and place, everything is one. Therefore, we count the days of the Omer in order to elevate and bind the dimension of time, represented by counting, to the dimension of beyond time, beyond place, for judgment is only ameliorated at its source. Therefore, specifically by means of the Omer measure of barley, representing all the constrictions corresponding to place, we elevate the dimension of place, and by means of the counting, the essence of time, we elevate time to beyond time, which is why we count the days of the Omer. However, the most important thing is the raising of the Omer, representing the elevating of place to the place of the world, which purifies place, because place is the domain of the world of action. Time, though, is more subtle than place, because time cannot be grasped, and therefore place, which is more in the category of the world of action, is the main thing to work on, for it causes a person to sin when one is not able to withstand the tests of his place. Therefore, when place is purified by the raising of the Omer, we rise beyond place and automatically rise and bind all days to beyond time. That is why we count the days of the Omer, for the purification of days, binding them to the dimension of beyond time, is by means of the raising of the Omer, by means of which they are bound to the place of the world, where they are rectified. Thus, purifying place and binding it to the place of the world is the most important thing, and then the days will rise also. Section 16. This is alluded to in the Rebbe's words in this lesson on the verse, "Sanctity is beautiful for your temple, O God, for long days." God is the place of the world, and He constricted His presence in the temple only because there were beautiful things in it. For the design of the temple corresponded to the design of creation and the design of the Garden of Eden. See Introduction to the Tikkuni Zohar. In this way He drew His holiness there, but He remains the place of the world, and thus, O God, for long days. For that is how He is able to judge the world with compassion, and is able to make Rosh Hashanah, which is a long day. See there in the lesson. Rosh Hashanah, being a long day, represents beyond time, corresponding to the day that is wholly long, and therefore the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah become one, representing a long day, corresponding to beyond time. On Rosh Hashanah, when He judges the world with compassion, for He is the place of the world, and knows the place of each and every individual, He raises each one from his narrow place into expansion to the dimension of beyond place, as in, "I called out to you from the narrows, you answered me with expansion," which we recite on Rosh Hashanah prior to shofar blowing. The greatest compassion is to expand the constricted place of each individual, corresponding to rising from the dimension of place to the dimension of beyond place, and thus creating a long day, corresponding to beyond time. For when we elevate place to beyond place, time automatically rises to beyond time, for place is lower. Section 17. Therefore, we count 49 days, corresponding to the filling of the imperfection of the moon, as in, the light of the moon will be like the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be sevenfold. Isaiah 30:26, which is 7 times 7, 49. The imperfection of the moon and its diminishing represents the constriction of place, the opposite of beyond place. The moon was diminished because it said, "2 kings cannot use 1 crown." And God responded, "Then diminish yourself, for 2 kings cannot use 1 crown." Chulin 60b. This represents the diminishing and constricting of place, as if the place is too narrow to contain 2 kings in one crown. For beyond place there can be no crowdedness at all, for there is place for everyone. Therefore God said to it, "Then diminish yourself." Since the moon was using the argument of the constriction of place, it was inevitable that it must become diminished. For in the dimension of place one must contract, for there is narrowness and crowdedness. But prior to this argument, there were 2 major luminaries, representing the dimension of beyond place, in which they both can be big, since there is no limitation of place. Thus, on account of the diminishing of the moon, corresponding to harsh judgments to place, the forces of evil are able to wield power. Furthermore, the diminishing of the moon is the root of the darkness of night. For prior to its diminishing, night shined as the day, Psalms 139:12, and the darkness of night represents the main imperfection in the dimension of time. This world, which is in time, is compared to night, while the world of the future, which is a long day, beyond time, is compared to day. Hence, the power of the forces of evil is drawn from the diminishing of the moon, for their power is mainly within place and time. In other words, knowledge was diminished, in that we do not know how to bind and elevate place and time to beyond place and time, as it had been before the diminishing, when all was one. Therefore, during the days of the Omer counting, we elevate and bind place and time to beyond place and time, by means of which we take leave of the defilement of Egypt and fill the imperfection of the moon. That is why we count 49 days, which represents the filling of the moon. Section 18. This corresponds to the 7 weeks, so that each day of the 7 days of creation should be absorbed into the Shabbat. For Shabbat is beyond time, beyond place, as in, "You blessed it more than all days, and hallowed it more than all times." The Shabbat is blessed and elevated beyond all days and times, and therefore our sages interpreted the verse, "It is all one for him," Psalms 139:17, as also referring to the Shabbat, as Rashi explains there. For this verse is the concept of beyond time. The Shabbat is also in the category of beyond place, and on it we bind and elevate all places to the dimension of beyond place. This corresponds to, "No man shall leave his place on the 7th day," Exodus 16:30. For each individual's place of rest for the Shabbat is set by the place in which he is. The place where one is at the commencement of the Shabbat becomes sanctified with the holiness of the Shabbat, as in, "For the place upon which you are standing is holy earth," Exodus 3:5. For that place is sanctified, elevated, and bound to beyond place. For all worlds rise on the Shabbat from their places to above and beyond. This corresponds to, "Whoever makes the Shabbat blissful will receive a limitless inheritance." Shabbat 1:18a, which represents beyond place, where there is no narrowness or crowdedness at all, represented by Jacob's inheritance, about whom is written, "You shall break out westward and eastward." Genesis 28:14. For he was beyond place, as in, he encountered the place, as said above. There, he was also beyond time, as in, he slept there, for the sun had set prematurely, representing beyond time, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 2. 79 for Jacob was in the category of beyond time, corresponding to Shabbat. Section 19. This corresponds to the 3rd meal of the Shabbat, which is at the afternoon mincha time, represented by Jacob, by means of which one attains a limitless inheritance, which is Jacob's inheritance, which is beyond place. Therefore, Moses departed this world at this time of day, when the will of wills is revealed. For Moses and Jacob are in the same category, as stated in the Holy Zohar, that Moses' burial place was beyond place, as in, "No man knew his burial place." Deuteronomy 34:50. It was beyond place, as our sages said about it. The higher beings perceived it as below, and the lower beings perceived it as above. Sifri, which represents beyond place, since no one knew its place. That is why the Mincha time on Shabbat is a time of great goodwill, for it is beyond place, the place of the world, where there is great goodwill and great compassion. For all are judged there favorably with compassion. Therefore, we recite at that time, my prayer, a time of goodwill, at which point the prayer leader dons a talit, for Tzitzit represent beyond place, which evokes great goodwill. This corresponds to Tzitzit of wool, which allude to great compassion and very great goodwill, represented by the white Tzitzit, in which God wrapped himself before reciting before Moses the 13 divine attributes of compassion, Brachot 17b. This corresponds to, his garment was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like clean wool, Daniel 7:9, which is the source of the light of the Tzitzit. As brought in Kabbalistic texts, the Tzitzit represent great compassion, for they correspond to the throne of glory, the place of the world, by means of which great compassion and great goodwill are evoked. This corresponds to, I was watching as the throne was elevated, and the Ancient of Days sat down. His garment was like white snow. For Tzitzit are the rectification of garments, corresponding to the throne of glory, and they judge the entire world favorably with great compassion. This corresponds to, if your sins will be as red thread, they will become as white as snow. If they are red as crimson, they will become as wool. Isaiah 1:18, represented by the thread of Techelis that cleansed sins on Yom Kippur. For the Tzitzit correspond to the place of the world and judge all favorably, which brings forgiveness for all sins. Section 20. Therefore, at the beginning of Yom Kippur, we immediately wrap ourselves in Tzitzit, for the loving kindness and compassion of the forgiveness of sins comes mainly via the Tzitzit, where everyone has a place, by means of which everyone is judged favorably and their sins are forgiven. This corresponds to the chain of 13 windings in the Tzitzit, corresponding to the 13 divine attributes of compassion. This corresponds to, there is a place with me, Exodus 33:21 said, when God wanted to wrap himself in the Tzitzit to teach Moses the 13 divine attributes of compassion. From this very verse our sages derived, from here we learn that God is the place of the world, and the world is not his place. Genesis Rabbah 68, for the two are interrelated. Since God is the place of the world, all the attributes of compassion are evoked, since he knows the place of each and every individual, which is represented by the wrapping of oneself in the Tzitzit, which corresponds to the place of the world. Section 21. This corresponds to the knots and windings of the Tzitzit, to break, shatter, and ameliorate all the bonds of the forces of evil. Place, represented by the world of action, corresponding to constriction, represented by physical material, corresponds to the bond with which something is bound, and in which it is constricted until it becomes completely physical. Therefore, the word for material, chomer, also means a knot, as in Rabbi Shimon expounded on this verse as a chomer kedushin 22b, which Rashi explains there as a knot. This is because material, representing place, corresponds to a knot, and from the dimension of place, of constriction, of a knot and bond, all the bonds of the forces of evil arise. Whoever does not guard himself from them will be trapped in their knots, which they bind every day, as in, ropes have they spread as a net. Psalms 140:6. For whenever a person becomes trapped in any sin or obstacle, this is like a bond, as in, those bound to oppression and iron. Psalms 107:10. This corresponds to Asur, the prohibited. All sins are called Isurim, prohibitions, the same root as a bond, for through sin one becomes bound, as in, as birds snared in a trap. Ecclesiastes 9:12 and 1 must beg of God to be released from them. This corresponds to the knots and windings of the Tzitzit, which have many double knots and multiple windings, in order to thereby break and ameliorate all the knots and windings of the forces of evil. This is because Tzitzit represent the place of the world, in which are all the places of the world, which represent knots, materiality, and therefore that is where all things are ameliorated. Whoever has become trapped in some place, even if he has become multiply bound at a very low level, to the point of feeling that it is impossible to take leave of that place, due to all the bonds in which he is bound. Nevertheless, through the Tzitzit, the place of the world, the place of all roots and bonds in the world, representing place, corresponding to materiality, represented by all the knots and windings of the Tzitzit, all things are ameliorated. All types of knots and windings of the forces of evil are all ameliorated and eradicated by the windings and knots of the Tzitzit, which represent the place of the world, for judgment can only be ameliorated at its source. Therefore, there are 39 windings, corresponding to the 39 lights that emerge from the first 3 letters of the divine name, represented by the 3 forefathers, the 3 festivals, which is the source of Tzitzit, as said above. The 39 lights correspond to the holiness of the Shabbat, in contrast to the 39 acts of the weekdays, which correspond to the filth of the serpent, as can be understood from the Rebbe's words elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 11. The 39 acts correspond to the filth of the serpent, the source of all sins, which correspond to the knots of the forces of evil, for all the 39 acts correspond to knots. For an act is represented by a knot and a constriction, as in, the entire wall was bound half its height, Nehemiah 3:38. Shabbat corresponds to beyond place, where all the 39 acts, corresponding to knots, to constrictions, represented by the materiality of place, are eradicated. Therefore, the 39 acts are derived from the sanctuary Shabbat, 49b, for all the 39 acts were used in building the sanctuary. For the 39 acts in the sanctuary corresponded to the 39 lights, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 11. Therefore, the 39 acts, the filth of the serpent, corresponding to constrictions, to place, are all ameliorated and eradicated by means of the 39 acts of the sanctuary. For the sanctuary, corresponding to the temple, which was beyond place, was a little that holds a lot, for in the sanctuary was the ark, which was a little that held a lot. This corresponds to the 39 windings of the Tzitzit to eradicate all the windings and knots of the forces of evil. For the 39 windings of the Tzitzit correspond to the 39 lights, which correspond to the place of the world. This corresponds to our sages' teaching. If a person has done bonds and bonds of sins, he should counter them with bonds and bonds of mitzvoth. Leviticus, Rabbah, 21:5. Sins correspond to bonds and knots, and bonds of mitzvoth must be done to counter them in order to break those bonds with the bonds of holiness. This is the meaning of the windings and knots of the Tzitzit. Section 22. This is why a chain is not less than 3 windings. Sifri, numbers, for the main element in the knot of holiness, is represented by Jacob, who corresponds to the tripled thread will not unravel quickly, Ecclesiastes 4:12, and he constitutes all the 3 forefathers, who correspond to the 3 festivals. He also corresponds to a chained branch of a tree, the Aravat of Sukkot, Leviticus 23:40. A chain is not less than 3, which represents Sukkot, which is the 3rd festival. This corresponds to Jacob, for that is when we take the 4 species and bind and knot 3 of them together, representing the 3 forefathers corresponding to Jacob. They shine into the etrog, which represents the pupil of the eye, by means of which the 4 species are perfected. This corresponds to the 4 tzitzit, which have chains, and each chain must have a minimum of 3 windings, altogether 39 windings and 5 double knots, totaling 10 knots, altogether 49, corresponding to the 49 days of the Omer, which correspond to the filling of the moon, by elevating and bonding place and time above, as said, which corresponds to Tzitzit. Section 23. This corresponds to Tzitzit of linen. Linen represents judgments, as in, the angel Gabriel was wearing linen, Ezekiel 9:2. This corresponds to Cain, who brought an offering of produce, specifically flaxseed, something of low value, for he judged everyone negatively. Hence, linen corresponds to judging people negatively, representing judgments, and through the mitzvah of tzitzit, by means of the thread of wool, which is the thread of techiles, corresponding to the throne of glory, the place of the world, even linen is ameliorated, so that we are able to judge everyone favorably by knowing the place of each person. Section 24. Related to earlier, Tzitzit come from the 3 festivals that shine into the angel, for Tzitzit correspond to an angel, which corresponds to the world of creation, as in, God's angel encamps around those who revere him and saves them. Psalms 34:8, which corresponds to Tzitzit, which surround the person. The Tzitzit correspond to an angel that is created by the reverence that is perfected by the 3 festivals, which is the essential perfection of prayer. This is represented by the beauty of Tzitzit, 1/3 chains and 2/3 strands. Orach Chaim 11:11. The Tzitzit are comprised of 3/3, corresponding to the 3 forefathers who correspond to the 3 festivals, from where the Tzitzit emanate. Therefore, 1/3 is chains and 2/3 are strands, for the knots and windings correspond to Jacob, who was the 3rd of the forefathers. For the main bond of holiness is represented by 3, as in a chained branch of a tree. Section 25. The linen and the barley were stricken, because the barley is of spring. Exodus 9:31. Linen and barley are in the same category, corresponding to judgments, to place, for physical place corresponds to constrictions and judgments. Therefore, the linen and the barley were stricken, represents judgments, constriction, place, for the essence of place comes from the striking of the lights in each other, as brought in Kabbalistic texts. Thus, stricken represents the striking of the lights, representing place, represented by the stricken divine name YHVH, whose numerical value spells out place, which represents constrictions and judgments. Hence, linen and barley represent place, and by raising the omer of barley and counting the omer, we elevate place and time to their source, to beyond place, beyond time, where all things are ameliorated. Eventually, we thereby reach the 50th day, the day of Shavuot, the time of Torah giving, when Israel rose above the angels by receiving the Torah, the hidden treasure that was not given to the angels, but to us, as written, "How awesome is your name throughout the earth! You have given your glory above the heavens." Psalms 8:2. Then we are able to hold on to the throne of glory, the roots of souls, the place of the world, corresponding to the 50th day, which corresponds to the 50 gates of understanding, which correspond to the Yovel, Jubilee year, the world of the future, which corresponds to Kol Binah, understanding the mother, and the mother hovers in the throne. And on Shavuot we rise to the beard, to the Ancient of Days, for the 13 rectifications of the beard, corresponding to the 13 principles of the Torah, shine at that time. They are the source of the light of the Tzitzit, by means of which we are able to hold on to the throne of glory and maintain rule over the angels. We attain this by accepting the Torah on Shavuot, and by means of Tzitzit, which are at the 4 corners, corresponding to 4 hairs, as in, the hair of his head was like clean wool, Daniel 7. 9 corresponding to the throne of glory, to Tekaios. The judgments attached to the garments represented by linen are thereby ameliorated, for they rise and are bound to the place of the world, to the throne of glory, where all things are ameliorated. Hence, on Shavuot, when the omer measure of barley is perfectly ameliorated, and when the light of the Tzitzit, which constitutes the complete fulfilling of the Torah, is evoked, linen and barley are then ameliorated. The stricken linen and barley, alluding to the totality of judgments attached to time and place, corresponding to constrictions, are ameliorated, for on Shavuot, which is Torah-giving, corresponding to Tzitzit, we are able to rise beyond place, beyond time. This verse, the linen and the barley, allude to the mitzvah of the omer of barley, as our sages derived from this verse that the omer must come from barley. Regarding the omer offering, it says, of spring, roasted in fire, and there the verse says, the barley was of spring. Section 26. Related to earlier, the filling of the moon corresponds to the rectification of place, elevating place to beyond place. This is what the Rebbe states in the lesson that God is the place of the world and knows the place of each and every individual, and therefore he fixed in his compassion a day of judgment on Rosh Hashanah, on the new moon, which rectifies the imperfection of the moon. Study there well. This is because, specifically, on the new moon, God regrets having diminished the moon, by means of which a rectification is evoked on every new moon to rectify it. This rectification of the imperfection of the moon corresponds to the rectification of place, rising to the dimension of beyond place. Hence, on the new moon, which is the rectification of the moon, God shines the dimension of beyond place, corresponding to repentance, to rectify all sins. Therefore, it is a great kindness that he fixed the day of judgment on the new moon, when the imperfection of the moon is rectified, for the dimension of beyond place shines at that time. God then judges the entire world with compassion, each according to his place, as in, do not judge another until you have reached his place. For God is the place of the world, and the rectification of the moon also comes from beyond place. Law 4. Wrapping ourselves in the Tzitzit, as the Ishmaelites wrap themselves, can be understood with Likutey Moharan, Part 1:8. It is explained there that Tzitzit correspond to the spirit of life evoked by a sigh, represented by a merchant Bava Batra, 73b, specifically an Ishmaelite merchant, representing, for God heard your affliction, Genesis 16:11, which is the source of the spirit of life, represented by the Tzitzit, represented by a merchant, as in, the spirit goes round and round, Ecclesiastes 1:6. This is why we wrap ourselves in the Tzitzit specifically as the Ishmaelites do, for Tzitzit correspond to the spirit of life, represented by an Ishmaelite merchant. For this reason, Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites, for Joseph represents Tzitzit, as brought in the Orach Chaim on the verse, your son Joseph has come to you, Genesis 48:2, which is the mystery of the Tzitzit. Therefore, we must separate the strands of the Tzitzit, for Tzitzit correspond to the spirit of life that is evoked from the four spirits, from where the four elements devolve, to which all traits are attached, to the evil of which the wicked are attached. But by the sacredness of the mitzvah of Tzitzit, we are able to reach the source of the four elements in their holiness, which are the four letters of the divine name, YHVH, separating the evil from the four elements, thereby subduing the wicked to the ground, as explained in the lesson. This is represented by our separating the strands of the Tzitzit in order to cause thereby all evildoers will be separated. Psalms 92:10. All the wicked who are attached to the evil of the four elements, who correspond to Esau was a hairy man, Genesis 27:11. For this reason, our sages said that we must separate the strands, as the strands of Aramites, Menachot 42a, which Rashi explains, as the hairs of Gentiles. The Tzitzit correspond to hairs, and we thereby subdue. Esau was a hairy man. Esau, who was completely like a mantle of hair. Genesis 25. 25, like a tallit. Therefore, by separating the strands as the strands of Aramites, we separate the attachment of Esau the hairy man, who is attached to the hairs, the source of attachment of all the wicked. By means of the Tzitzit, all the wicked are separated and fall away, as in, for your enemies will perish. All evildoers will be separated, as in, he lowers the wicked to the ground. Psalms 147, 6, as stated in the lesson. Law 5. Tzitzit can be explained with Lesson 2, 8. See the entire lesson there well, from beginning to end. Section 1. Tzitzit represent the thread of loving kindness that is braided and woven from the 72 strings upon which the song of loving kindness to be aroused in the future will be played. This is the voice that waters the garden, where all reverence and all fragrances grow. Specifically, by means of this voice is a rebuker, able to rebuke the Jewish people and not make things worse with his rebuke. On the contrary, he will give and add a pleasant fragrance to the souls of his audience by his rebuke with this voice. This corresponds to the rebuke of Moses, who rebuked the people over the golden calf, for by means of his rebuke he added and gave them a pleasant fragrance, as in, my spikenard gave off its fragrance. Song of Songs 1:12. The verse does not say let off, but gave off. Shabbat 88b. See there all this well. From this thread of loving kindness, the light of the strands of the holy Tzitzit are drawn. There are 32 strands, each one of 2 threads, for they must be woven, and 32 times 2 equals 64. Adding to that the 8 strands of each corner, and we reach 72, the numerical value of the word for loving kindness. In other words, the sacredness of the strands of Tzitzit are drawn from the light of the thread of loving kindness, which is braided and woven from the 72 strings, which correspond to the strings upon which the song of loving kindness of the future will be played, as explained in the lesson. The Tzitzit correspond to the rebuke that a person is rebuked to fulfill God's commandments and not stray after the passions of his heart and eyes, as written in the section of Tzitzit. You shall see it and remember all of God's commandments and do them, and not stray after your hearts. Numbers 15:39. And, as our sages said, because the Techels resembles the sea resembles the sky, and the sky resembles the throne of glory. Numbers Rabbah 4:13. Hence, the Tzitzit were given in order to remember and rebuke a person not to stray after his heart and eyes, but to fulfill all of God's commandments. The strands of the Tzitzit correspond to the thread of loving kindness, which corresponds to the voice of the rebuker, by means of which he is able to rebuke and to add a pleasant fragrance to the souls. Section 2. Tzitzit correspond to David's harp, as brought in the Holy Zohar and in the Tikkunim, number 10. This corresponds to, from the corner of the earth we heard melodies. Isaiah 24:17, as brought elsewhere. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 8. Specifically, from the corner of the earth, representing the corners of the Tzitzit, where all melodies and songs come from, as in, we heard melodies. This is because the strands of the Tzitzit represent the thread of loving kindness upon which the song of the future will be played, from where all melodies and songs are drawn. Even all songs and melodies of today are all drawn from this song, which is the song of the future that will be played on the 72 strings, represented by the strands of Tzitzit. Section 3. This is represented by the Techels of the Tzitzit, for Techels represents the throne of judgment, as stated in the Holy Zohar, Part 2, 147a, since the thread of loving kindness, corresponding to the sound of the melody of the future, represented by the strand of Tzitzit, is mainly drawn from the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, as explained well in the lesson. This is represented by the techiles of the Tzitzit, which represents the throne of judgment, corresponding to prayer as judgment. That is the root of Tzitzit, which correspond to the thread of loving kindness. This corresponds to might and splendor are her garments. She laughs on the last day. Proverbs 31:25. Might and splendor are her garments corresponds to the tzitzit that are drawn from prayer as judgment, which is called a staff of might, by means of which God's glory and splendor are enhanced. Thus, by means of might and splendor are her garments, which corresponds to tzitzit, she laughs on the last day, alluding to the melody that will be aroused in the future. On the last day, when our mouths will be filled with laughter and our tongues with song. Psalms 126:2. This melody corresponds to tzitzit, and therefore, by means of tzitzit, which correspond to might and splendor are her garments, she will laugh on the last day, for one will attain the song of the future, which corresponds to laughter and joy, as in, our mouths will be filled with laughter. This corresponds to God reigns, He dons pride, God dons might, Ibid 93:1. A garment of might corresponds to tzitzit, which are drawn from the staff of might, as above, and the light of this garment will be manifested in the future when His kingdom is manifested, as in, God reigns, He dons pride. God dons might, for when God reigns in the future, this song, represented by the garment of might, corresponding to tzitzit, to the thread of loving kindness, will be aroused. Section 4. The essence of tzitzit is to rectify the garments, for the root of tzitzit, which correspond to the melody, to the thread of loving kindness, is drawn from prayer as judgment, by means of which we attain a prophetic spirit, by means of which we rectify and refine the power of imagination, by means of which we attain perfect faith, and by means of this faith will the world be renewed. This is because the renewal of the world is impossible to understand with logic, but only by faith. With faith, the world will be renewed in the future, and this song, which is an amazing song, corresponding to the thread of loving kindness, the root of tzitzit, will be aroused. Therefore, by means of this thread, represented by the strands of the tzitzit that are drawn at their root from the sorting out and rectification of the power of imagination, we thereby rectify garments and clothing. For all garments and clothing are drawn from the power of imagination, which corresponds to the garment of the intellect. Therefore, just as a person is able to resemble another person by changing his clothes to the point that others will mistake him and not recognize him, so it is possible that the power of imagination may cause a mistake and distortion in the intellect, distorting the intellect from sound logic to distorted logic, to the point that authentic sound logic cannot be recognized. This is because unrefined imagination clothes and conceals the intellect to the point that authentic intellect is not recognized, for the imagination is the garment of the intellect. Thus, one must toil to refine the imagination, for the main perfection of the holy faith is by refining the imagination, as explained well in the lesson. We must tirelessly endeavor to seek and beg of God to have the privilege of becoming the follower of an authentic tzaddik who possesses a Holy Spirit, so that through him we will attain perfect faith, which is the foundation of everything. The essence of refining the imagination, by means of which we attain perfect faith, is by means of the Holy Spirit, the prophetic spirit, as stated in the lesson, which is all evoked by the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik. And when we refine the imagination, by means of which we attain faith, we thereby attain the song of loving kindness, from which the tzitzit are drawn. Therefore, we tie the tzitzit to the garments in order to rectify them, for garments correspond to the power of imagination, which is the garment of the intellect. Section 5. At the end of the lesson, on the verse, "For the day of our festival," it is explained that all titles and praises with which we praise and exalt God are in the category of imagination. This is because at the depth of the human comprehension, God is exalted and beyond all titles and praises, and all titles and praises are thus merely imaginative. All the titles and praises corresponding to the imagination represent the king's garments, as in, "You donned majesty and splendor," Psalms 104:1. All the titles and praises with which we glorify and exalt His name, corresponding to majesty and splendor, represent garments, as in, "You donned majesty and splendor," as Rabbi Yochanan referred to his garments as his honor, Shabbat 113a. Hence, garments correspond to glory, representing the glory, splendor, and praise with which we glorify and praise Him with praises and titles, all of which corresponds to the power of imagination, all of which represents garments, which are referred to as honor. Therefore, by means of the praises and titles corresponding to the imagination, we elevate all the worlds, for the totality of all the worlds represents the garments of the King, as known. The imagination, the source of praises and titles, corresponds to garments, to the garment of the intellect, and all material garments are drawn from imagination, which is the garment of the intellect. Therefore, by means of the light of the Tzitzit, which is evoked through the authentic and very powerful tzaddik, for by means of his prayer as judgment, he refines the imagination, by means of which he attains the song of loving kindness, which is the source of Tzitzit, we rectify the garments that are drawn from the imagination, so that with this power we will be able to refine our own power of imagination, which corresponds to garments, so that we will attain perfect faith in God's uniqueness and oneness, and in the creation of the world. That is the foundation of everything, as explained elsewhere. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 7, that Tzitzit are a remedy for faith. Thus we find explained in the Tikkunim, 5 double knots correspond to Shema Yisrael, to the 5 strands of David's harp, number 5, page 25b. Therefore it was instituted to recite the section of Tzitzit with the Shema, and therefore we gather and hold the Tzitzit during Kriyat Shema. For Tzitzit, the rectification of garments, the rectification of the imagination, correspond to faith, for the perfection of faith is by means of the refinement of the imagination. Thus, the entire Torah is dependent upon the Tzitzit, as written, "You shall see it and remember all of God's commandments." Numbers 15:39. For the fulfillment of the entire Torah is dependent upon faith, which is the foundation of everything. As written, "All your commandments are faith." Psalms 119:86. And as our sages said, Habakkuk came and established them on one. A tzaddik lives by his faith. Habakkuk 2:4, Makot 24a. Section 6. Therefore, the first step in accepting the yoke of Torah upon oneself is by means of the Tzitzit. When we begin training a child in the commandments, the first mitzvah that we teach him is that of Tzitzit, and the first mitzvah that we fulfill every morning when we arise from sleep is the Tzitzit. For Tzitzit correspond to the rectification and refinement of the imagination, which is the rectification of garments, by means of which the holy faith, the foundation and root of the entire Torah and the commandments, is refined. Each and every day in the morning, the light of the Tzitzit emerges, corresponding to the thread of loving kindness, as in, "To declare your loving kindness in the morning, and your faith at nights." Psalms 72:3, as explained in the lesson. All this is evoked by means of the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik. This corresponds to rising at midnight to wail and mourn over the destruction of the temple and making an effort to study Torah at that time. Rising at midnight to mourn over the destruction of the temple corresponds to prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, for those who rise at midnight are called mighty ones who do his word. For the power to rise from sleep at midnight is mainly drawn from judgments, which is represented by the sound of the rooster, who is called judgments, which is drawn from the flame of fire that strikes its wings. All this is evoked by the prayer as judgment of powerful tzaddik, by means of which he attains the sound of the song. Therefore, an illumination from the sound of this song is evoked at midnight from the prayer as judgment. This is represented by David's harp playing by itself at midnight by means of the northerly wind that blew through it, Brachot 3b. The northerly wind, which corresponds to judgments, is what made David's harp play by itself, for the essence of the melody played by David's harp is drawn from the song that is evoked by the prayer as judgment, which corresponds to the northerly wind. Therefore, that is why we are aroused from sleep at midnight, for this song is evoked from the rectification and refinement of the imagination, which corresponds to sleep, and therefore it has the power to rouse and awaken from sleep. For the overpowering force of sleep is only due to an imagination that has not been properly refined. However, the person who has properly refined the imagination does not need to sleep much, and even the bit that he does sleep is very holy. Therefore, by means of David's harp that plays by itself by means of the northerly wind, which represents the refinement of imagination, we are aroused from sleep. By refining the imagination, sleep is dispelled, and we rise to wail over the destruction of the temple. Then, by mourning over the destruction of the temple, we receive power from the prayer of the powerful tzaddik, which corresponds to judgment. This is because the lamentations over the destruction of the temple correspond to prayer as judgment, for all mourning and lamentations correspond to judgment. Even the wording of the lamentations are in an argumentative and complaining mode, that God has stricken us, destroyed our temple, and exiled us among the nations, as we say. Where are your jealousy and your might? Why do you lead us astray from your ways? Have you loathed Judah? Why have you stricken us? Why do you forget us forever? Remember, O God, what we had, and many similar statements. All these phrases are in the category of prayer as judgment, corresponding to the prayer of Pinchas, who argued his Creator, as stated in the lesson. We must thus mourn over the destruction of the temple, for the destruction of the temple corresponds to the blemish and destruction of the intellect. For whoever possesses intellect is as if the temple was built in his days, as our sages said, Brachot 33a, as brought many times in the Rebbe's teachings. This is because the walls of the temple correspond to the walls of the intellect, to the walls that surround the mind and protect it from sexual lust. But due to our many sins, the forces of evil have been empowered, as in, the serpent was clever, ultimately causing the destruction of the temple, which is the blemish of the intellect. And this requires the prayer of the powerful tzaddik, which is in the category of judgment. That is why we must rise at midnight to mourn and wail over the destruction of the temple, for the lamentations correspond to prayer as judgment, so that we will receive power from the prayer of the powerful tzaddik, which corresponds to judgment, in order to extract all the vitality that the forces of evil have swallowed, as in, it swallowed vitality and shall vomit it, Job 20:15, in order to rectify the intellect. That is why we study Torah at this time, for the Torah corresponds to the prophetic spirit. The entire Torah is embodied within the 10 Commandments, which correspond to the 10 levels of prophecy, as explained in the lesson. For by means of prayer as judgment, we are able to attain the prophetic spirit, which corresponds to Torah study after midnight. All this in order to refine the imagination. Therefore, it is very important to study Torah specifically at night. As our sages said, a person can only acquire the crown of Torah at night, and as written, rise, sing at night, Lamentations 2:19. This is because the essence of Torah study is to refine the imagination, for the Torah corresponds to the 10 Commandments, to the prophetic spirit, by means of which the imagination is refined. Therefore, Torah study is mainly at night, for night corresponds to imagination, which corresponds to sleep, at which time we need to refine the imagination by means of the Torah which corresponds to the prophetic spirit. This is mainly after midnight, when David's harp was roused by the northerly wind, which represents the song that is evoked by prayer as judgment, which is the main refinement of the imagination. Therefore, that is the time to study Torah, to refine the imagination in order to attain perfect faith, as in your faith at nights. Through this, the thread of loving kindness is evoked, quote, end quote, as in to declare your loving kindness in the morning and your faith at nights, as explained in the lesson. Now, how eloquent are our sages' words. Whoever studies Torah at night, a thread of loving kindness will be drawn upon him by day. As written, God commands his kindness by day, and by night his song is with me. Psalms 42:9. Hagigah 12b. By Torah study at night, which corresponds to the prophetic spirit, which embodies the entire Torah, the imagination is refined, which is the refinement of faith, by means of which we attain the song, which corresponds to the thread of loving kindness, upon which this song will be played. This is the thread of loving kindness that is drawn upon a person by day, which corresponds to the thread of loving kindness which the proper rebuker attains, as stated in the lesson. Thus, the thread of loving kindness that is drawn by day, specifically by means of Torah study at night, corresponds to the light of the strands of the Tzitzit, which are the rectification of the garments, which correspond to the imagination, that is, the refinement of the imagination, which is the refinement of faith, which is the foundation of the entire Torah. Section 7. The entire Torah is contained in the category of garments, as written, "At all times your garments shall be white." Ecclesiastes 9:8, which was said regarding the general fulfillment of Torah and commandments, by means of which we attain white garments, corresponding to a rabbinical garment, which is the garment of the soul that each individual will merit in the future world according to the Torah, and commandments that he was able to fulfill in this world. The main rectification of garments is by means of tzitzit, which is why our sages said, "At all times your garments shall be white." This refers to tzitzit, Shabbat 1:53b. The tzitzit embody the totality of fulfilling the Torah and the commandments, corresponding to white garments, as written, "So that you remember all of God's commandments." For by means of tzitzit, corresponding to the thread of loving kindness, the rebuke of the authentic rebuker is evoked upon a person, enabling the person to endow a pleasant fragrance upon the souls. Thus, even when this person rebukes others for their sins, he does not arouse the bad odor of the sins, but on the contrary, transforms their sins into merits with the voice of his rebuke, thus adding a pleasant fragrance to the souls, as in, "My spikenard gave off its fragrance." Song of Songs 1:12. The verse does not say, "let off," but "gave off Shabbat" 88b. This corresponds to tzitzit, which represent rebuke, as in, "You shall see it, and remember, and not stray." For the tzitzit rebuke a person to fulfill the commandments, and not to stray after his heart's passions. However, rebuke can sometimes cause a person to fall even further, for it can rouse the bad odor of one's bad conduct, which weakens the soul even more, as explained at the beginning of the lesson. We see this in reality when a person sometimes rebukes himself and begins to remember the evil deeds he has done, frequently falling even further, for he gets very depressed. Some people have fallen greatly because of this. All this is caused by improper rebuke that weakens the soul by arousing the bad odor of the sins. Therefore, no one can rebuke himself, and certainly not another person, unless he has bound himself to the authentic tzaddikim of the generation who are in the category of Moses, who are able to rebuke with the voice of Moses' rebuke, which is the sound of the song, by means of which they add and imbue the souls with fragrance. This is because the essence of rebuke must be in the category of the song of loving kindness, which means to judge favorably. corresponding to, I shall sing to God with my little bit, as stated elsewhere in the Rebbe's teachings. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 282. See the entire concept there. One must find within oneself some merit, some good point, and the same in others, representing another bit, and there is no wicked person, by means of which one actually enters into the realm of merit and becomes able to repent. Thus, anyone wanting to rebuke, even himself, must be very cautious not to cause himself to fall even further by his rebuke, not to despair and weaken his soul by remembering only his bad deeds, which may cause him to completely give up. Therefore, one must be cautious to judge favorably and to seek and find in oneself some point of good, giving the rebuke in a kind way, encouraging oneself in God and trusting in His awesome compassion. God has such great compassion that all of one's bad deeds can be transformed into merits, even if one has transgressed very greatly for many years. Nevertheless, God's loving kindness has not been exhausted, for His compassion is never ending. Lamentations 3:22-4. God's is loving kindness, and much salvation is with Him. Psalms 137. Thus, the essence of rebuke should be in a way that strengthens a person to be able to rouse himself to God, to begin henceforth to come closer to Him, rather than causing any further damage by one's rebuke, which would only cause one to fall even further because of a weakened soul. But only the tzaddikim of the generation, who are in the category of Moses, are able to attain such rebuke, for they attain the song of loving kindness. This corresponds to the holy Tzitzit, which God gave us the great privilege to have in order to remember His commandments and not stray after our hearts. This is rebuke. By means of the Tzitzit, which correspond to the thread of loving kindness, we are able to attain the rebuke of the authentic tzaddikim who are in the category of Moses, for they imbue the souls with fragrance, as in, my spikenard gave off its fragrance, such that even the bad deeds are transformed into merits and give off fragrance. The main fragrance of Torah and commandments is expressed in the garments of the soul, the rabbinical garment, and therefore, sins cause the garments to become fecal. These fecal garments represent the malodor of bad deeds, for odor is drawn specifically into garments, each person according to his actions, whether good or otherwise. Everything will be expressed in the odor. Bad deeds cause one's garments to be malodorous, corresponding to fecal garments, but by means of tzitzit, which are the rectification of garments, one attains proper rebuke, which causes the garments to give off fragrance, as in, the odor of your garments is like the odor of Lebanon. Song of Songs 4:11. Thus, our sages explain this verse as referring to the commandments that are dependent upon garments, such as tzitzit, for tzitzit correspond to good rebuke, which gives off fragrance. But the main fragrance in garments is created by one's own service, and the verse thus stresses the odor of your garments. Thus, all your garments are of myrrh, aloes, and cassia. Psalms 45:9 specifically, your garments, for garments give off fragrance by means of the Torah and commandments, as said. And thus our sages said on this verse, do not read your garments, but your betrayals, for even the betrayals give off fragrance, as in, my spikenard gave off its fragrance. It does not say let off, but gave off, meaning that even the bad deeds and the betrayals give off fragrance. Thus, do not read your garments, but your betrayals, for garments and betrayals are thus the same, specifically by means of the fragrance of your garments, brought about by means of the tzitzit, which are the main rectification of garments. Even all betrayals give off fragrance, for tzitzit correspond to the thread of loving kindness, which transforms sins into merits, and one attains, my spikenard gave off its fragrance, that even the bad deeds give off fragrance. This corresponds to the thread of wool that whitened the Jewish people's sins on Yom Kippur, as our sages said, Yoma 39a. Specifically, a thread corresponding to the strands of the Tzitzit, representing the thread of loving kindness, which transforms sins into merits, as in, my spikenard gave off its fragrance. This is the meaning of, come, let us dispute, says God. If your sins will be, if they are as red as crimson, they will be as wool. From where our sages derived to hang a thread on Yom Kippur. Thus, specifically, come, let us dispute. For to dispute is to rebuke. For only God is able to rebuke us with compassion. For he rebukes us with Moses' rebuke, by means of which we are able to fully repent, transforming sins into merits, corresponding to the thread of loving kindness. This is the meaning of, if they are as red as crimson, they will be as wool, which corresponds to the strands of Tzitzit. Only the tzaddikim who cleave to God's attributes and know of his compassion are able to rebuke like this, and to thus add fragrance. Section 8. This is what our sages said. This teaches us that God wrapped himself in a talit as a prayer leader and taught Moses the sequence of the 13 divine attributes of compassion, Rosh Hashanah 17b. The 13 divine attributes of compassion that God revealed to Moses after the sin of the golden calf represents his revealing to him his ways of loving kindness and his immense compassion and mercy in forgiving sins, as in, he bears iniquity and transgression. Therefore, he revealed this to him while wrapped in tzitzit. For the strands of tzitzit correspond to the thread of loving kindness, through which sins are forgiven and transformed into merits, giving off fragrance. This is why we wrap ourselves in tzitzit at the onset of Yom Kippur, for the forgiving of sins is through tzitzit, which corresponds to the thread of loving kindness. Section 9. Hence, tzitzit, which correspond to the thread of loving kindness, which corresponds to the voice that waters the garden, where all fragrances grow, correspond to, the voice was the voice of Jacob, Genesis 27:22, and why it is said of Jacob, see, my son's fragrance is as the fragrance of the field, Ibid, verse 27, as explained in the lesson. So come now and see God's wonders, for in that very section it is clearly explained that the fragrance that was manifested through Jacob's voice was manifested specifically in the garments which correspond to tzitzit, which rectify garments by means of the thread. This is why after stating, the voice is the voice of Jacob, it says, he smelled the fragrance of his garments, specifically the fragrance of his garments. For the fragrance that was manifested by Jacob's voice was mainly in the garments, as in the fragrance of your garments. This is because Jacob's voice corresponds to the thread of loving kindness, which is the strand of the tzitzit, which is the rectification of garments, which corresponds to the rabbinical garment, the garments of the soul, which give off fragrance. Section 10. These garments, which Jacob was then wearing, were the garments of Adam, which God had made for him after the sin. As written, God made leather garments for Adam and Eve and clothed them, Genesis 3:21. All garments in the world are drawn from these garments that God made for Adam, and are all embodied within the mitzvah of tzitzit, which is dependent upon garments, and which is the life force, root, and rectification of all garments in the world. This is because after the sin, God made for them garments, representing tzitzit, which are the totality of holy garments. For their main rectification was by means of the garments corresponding to tzitzit. Adam had sinned by eating from the tree of knowledge, by means of which he intensified the need for physical nourishment. As a result of, the serpent was clever. The rectification for this is by means of the prayer as judgment of the powerful Zaddik, which evokes the voice that waters the garden, which corresponds to, I heard your voice in the garden and feared. Thus, the verse very precisely concludes, because I was naked, I hid. Adam was saying that now he was naked, for now, after the sin, he he felt that he was naked. As written, they knew that they were naked, though previously they did not need clothing at all. As written, they were both naked. Before the sin, before their consciousness was damaged, they were able to recognize God at the center of their consciousness, and thus did not need to approach God only by means of garments corresponding to praises and titles that come from the imagination. They recognized him with their eyes, as will be the case in the future, when your eyes will see your master, and your master will no longer conceal himself. Isaiah 30:20. God will then not need to clothe himself in garments. But after the sin, after damaging consciousness, being banished from the Garden of Eden, and not knowing the way to the tree of life, the main rectification is now by means of garments. We can approach God only by means of many garments represented by the praises and titles. We must specifically put aside our knowledge and strengthen ourselves in perfect faith, speaking many words of faith, which are the songs, praises, prayers, and supplications that we say, for we are now able to come close to God only by means of faith, by means of refining the imagination, which corresponds to garments. These garments are rectified by means of the Tzitzit, which correspond to the voice that waters the garden. This is the meaning of, I heard your voice in the garden, which corresponds to Tzitzit. The verse thus concludes, for I was naked, naked, for now I need garments, and therefore you had compassion on me, and drew upon me the light of the Tzitzit, which corresponds to the voice, as in, I heard your voice in the garden. Then, after the sin, God tried to rectify them by making them garments, as in, God made them garments, which means that he drew the light of Tzitzit upon them, which are the main rectification of garments of holiness. Since the Tzitzit correspond to the voice that waters the garden, which evokes fragrance and diminishes the need for physical nourishment, represented by the heel of Esau. These are the garments that Jacob wore, for Jacob rectified the sin of Adam, since Jacob's appearance resembled Adam's appearance, Bava Metzia, 84a. For he evoked the voice, as in, the voice is the voice of Jacob, by means of which the garments gave off fragrance, as in, he smelled the fragrance of his garments. Jacob thus subdued and eliminated Esau's food, representing physical nourishment, and brought delicacies to his father, as he liked, which refers to the commandments, and not as he disliked, which would be the forbidden. This is because Jacob's food, which corresponds to soul nourishment, was elevated above physical nourishment, for by means of the voice, represented by Jacob's voice, Jacob was able to cause fragrance to rise, as in, see, my son's fragrance is as the fragrance of the field. Section 11. This corresponds to Shem and Japheth took the garment and placed it on their shoulders. Genesis 9:23. This refers to Tzitzit, as our sages said, Tikkuni Zohar, number 18, and as cited by the Rebbe Likutey Moharan, Part 1:7. Noah drank from the wine, became intoxicated and uncovered in his tent. Genesis 9:29. Regarding which the Zohar states that Noah's sin corresponded to the sin of Adam Tikkuni. Zohar, page 113a. Adam's sin corresponded to the blemish explained in the lesson, in that sometimes the forces of evil nourish from compassion and knowledge, as in, the serpent was clever, corresponding to Adam's sin which was caused by the serpent was clever, as explained in the lesson. This causes an intensification of the need for physical nourishment, for when the attachment to knowledge of the forces of evil, represented by the serpent was clever, is subdued and eliminated by prayer as judgment of the powerful Zaddik, everything is rectified and we attain the melody, corresponding to the strand of Tzitzit, by means of which we attain the fragrance of garments, corresponding to soul nourishment. However, when we are unable to rectify and subdue the attachment of the serpent was clever, the need for physical nourishment is then intensified, represented by the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, And when we are unable to rectify this, by means of the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, the imagination remains unrefined, corresponding to the filth of the serpent, represented by the confusion of the imagination, as explained in the lesson. So Noah, though he was a great tzaddik, had nevertheless not yet rectified Adam's sin, for he did not pray as he should have for the people of his generation, as stated in the Zohar in comparing Noah, Abraham, and Moses. Noah did not pray at all. Abraham prayed for his generation, but not as did Moses, who was willing to sacrifice his life for the Israelites. And the most potent prayer of the great tzaddik, through which he rectifies everything, is the prayer as judgment, by means of which he extracts the very life force from the forces of evil, thus rectifying everything. But such prayer requires of the tzaddik great sacrifice, and therefore the tzaddik is called a faithful messenger for those who send him. Proverbs 25:13, since he sacrifices himself for the Jewish people. Noah, though, did not sacrifice himself as did Moses, and did not attain prayer as judgment, and therefore was unable to save his generation and extract the waters of knowledge from the forces of evil. This brought about the flood which inundated the world, for in order to subdue and eliminate the treacherous waters, which are the forces of evil, which seek to flood the world, and to extract from there the waters of knowledge, prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik is required. This corresponds to the staff of might, which splits the Red Sea, as in, you shattered the sea with your might. You broke the heads of the serpents upon the water. Psalm 74:13. Thus, since Noah did not sacrifice himself and pray a prayer as judgment, he therefore did not bring about a complete rectification of the imagination, and his sin was thus of drinking wine and getting intoxicated. Section 12. This is because wine brings on sleep, which corresponds to the power of imagination. Thus, wine has two powers. If a person is worthy, it makes him happy, but if a person is unworthy, it desolates him. Yoma 76b, representing the wine that gladdens and the wine that intoxicates. The intoxication of wine corresponds to the confusion of the imagination, on account of which one speaks foolishness and irrationalities which arise from a confused imagination. These two powers of wine are dependent upon one's rectification of the covenant, as brought elsewhere in the Rebbe's teachings, which is mainly dependent upon prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, by means of which one extracts all the life force, all the knowledge, that the forces of evil have swallowed. This rectifies the mind, which constitutes the walls that protect from a damage to the covenant, by means of which one rectifies the covenant, as explained in the lesson. Then, by means of the prayer, corresponding to the rectification of the covenant, the imagination is refined and rectified, and then, when one drinks wine, one is worthy, and becomes a leader and is gladdened. This is the wine that gladdens, for one's mind has been elevated by the wine, and one has attained joy, which corresponds to the song and the melody that is evoked by the refining of the imagination, the source of all joy, as in, with an instrument of 10 strings, with a lyre. For you have gladdened me, O God, with your deeds. Psalms 92:4. Therefore, song is only sung over wine, brachot 35a. In sum, wine corresponds to sleep, to the power of imagination. For the nature of wine is to bring on sleep and to intensify the power of imagination, represented by intoxication, when one's mind becomes scattered by the wine, just as during sleep, and only the imagination remains. Thus, one speaks foolishness caused by the confused imagination. This is because the imagination of most people is not refined, and therefore one speaks foolishness and irrationally when intoxicated, just as a sleeping person whose imagination causes him confusions, which are the dreams that confuse most people, which arise from the confusion of the imagination during sleep. The tzaddik, however, who has rectified his imagination, has dreams that are refined, realistic, and authentic, corresponding to a dream via an angel. He has attained the Holy Spirit, corresponding to the prophetic spirit that refines the imagination, and therefore, even during sleep, he receives the Holy Spirit, corresponding to a dream via an angel. For dreams indeed correspond to prophecy, as our sages said, Brachot 57b, as in, I shall speak to him through a dream, Numbers 12:6. On the other hand, the one who has not refined his imagination, all types of confusions will become attached to it, and therefore, the confusions of the forces of evil cause confusing dreams to the person during sleep, as in a dream via a demon, which is caused by the confusion of the imagination corresponding to the filth of the serpent, as stated in the lesson. Thus, wine that brings on sleep and imagination has these two possibilities. He who refines his imagination and his wine is holy, corresponding to refined imagination, which is the wine that gladdens. This refined imagination brings to faith, which brings to the melody, which represents joy, corresponding to, with an instrument of 10 strings, with a lyre. For you have gladdened me, O God, which is the source of all joy. But when one's imagination is not refined, wine is then in the category of a confused imagination, which corresponds to intoxication, and wine then intoxicates. This corresponds to, as a drunkard wallows in his vomit, Isaiah 19:14. An intoxicated person naturally vomits, for when wine is holy and is drawn from prayer as judgment of the powerful Zadik, the forces of evil are forced to vomit, as in, it swallowed vitality and shall vomit it, vomiting all the knowledge and holiness that it had swallowed. But when the wine is not holy, then the person himself is forced to vomit. Section 13. Therefore, Noah, who was unable to pray as judgment, became intoxicated when he drank wine, for his imagination was not completely refined, which caused the wine to be intoxicating wine, for intoxication is a confusion of the imagination. Therefore, his rectification was by means of Tzitzit, as written, Shem and Japheth took the garment, which refers to Tzitzit, for the Tzitzit correspond to the thread of loving kindness, which corresponds to the song and the melody that is evoked by the refining of the imagination. Therefore, the Tzitzit rectified Noah's sin in blemishing the imagination by intoxication, for the Tzitzit evoked a rectification of the imagination, since they are drawn from the rectification of the imagination. Section 14. This corresponds to the wine of the libations, together with which songs are sung, for songs are only sung over wine. All of the sacrificial offerings represent the refining of the imagination, for the offerings come from animals and birds, which correspond to the imagination, for animals have the power of imagination, which is an animal power as brought elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 54. Therefore, we bring animals for offerings to refine the imagination, for the imagination is the cause of all sins, as explained elsewhere. That is why we bring animals for offerings, in order to rectify and refine the imagination, and that is why we then bring wine for libations and sing songs. Wine corresponds to sleep, to the imagination, and by the wine of the libations, a wine of holiness, the imagination is fully rectified, by means of which we are able to sing the song of the future, from where all songs come. This is the song that is sung only over wine, for the essence of song is the refining of the imagination, which corresponds to wine, as said. Section 15. This corresponds to the cup of wine for Kiddush, for the grace after meals, and for the Havdalah, all of which correspond to song is only sung over wine, as our sages said, Brachot 35b. This is because the essence of the holiness of the Shabbat and the festivals is by the manifestation of faith that is then revealed with an increased great light. Shabbat corresponds to faith in the renewal of the world, which is the essence of the Kiddush in which we recite, He finished, with which we attest that God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the Shabbat. Similarly, the festivals are also in the category of Shabbat that attest to the renewal of the world. For all the festivals are a commemoration for the exodus from Egypt, when faith in the renewal of the world was manifested to all mankind by means of the never before heard of or seen very awesome miracles, wonders and signs that God performed for us during the Exodus and the splitting of the Red Sea and the Torah giving. Hence, the Shabbat and the festivals point to the renewal of the world, which is the essence of faith, upon which Judaism, the very sacredness of the Jewish people, is dependent. But whoever denies this, even partially, is considered a complete heretic who has no portion in the God of Israel or in Moses' Torah. I will not expound here in disparagement of those who study books that are founded upon the theories of heretics and atheists, who famously deny the above, such as Aristotle and his colleagues. How can one consider studying books that cite the evil theories of such people, since they are complete heretics and atheists who completely deny Moses' Torah and God himself? Thus, anyone who studies them is completely separated from the faith. Thank God for sparing us. Thus, on the Shabbat and festivals, whose main holiness is by the manifestation of faith that is then revealed, for that is the essence of holiness, we therefore sing song over wine, represented by the Kiddush, for on Shabbat and festival the filth of the serpent is banished, and the imagination is refined and rectified. Wine is then holy, corresponding to the wine that gladdens, and by means of the wine, corresponding to imagination, perfect faith is evoked, which is the essence of the holiness of the Shabbat and festival. And by means of the faith, we are able to sing the song, represented by the Kiddush, which also corresponds to the song sung specifically over wine. Section 16. This corresponds to the cup of wine over the grace after meals. We must elevate and refine our eating so that it is in the category of soul nourishment, which is attained by the song, as said. Therefore, the grace after meals is mainly over the land of Israel, as written, "You shall eat, be satiated, and bless your God over the good land." Deuteronomy 8:10. For the land of Israel comes through the might of his deeds, corresponding to, in the beginning, God created. And Rabbi Yitzchak said, the Torah should not have begun with. It is explained there in the lesson that the land of Israel and the renewal of the world in the future correspond, and from there the song is aroused, lode, by means of which soul nourishment is intensified. Therefore, after eating, when we need to refine the food so that it will be soul nourishment, we then bless God over the good land, which is the land of Israel. This rouses the song that will be roused in the future, when God will renew his world as the land of Israel. By means of arousing this song, we are able to intensify soul nourishment over physical nourishment, and therefore we recite the grace after meals over wine, as in, song is only sung over wine, for it is impossible to rouse this song in order to attain soul nourishment other than by holy wine, which corresponds to the refining of the imagination, by means of which we attain faith, by means of which we attain the song. Section 17. Therefore, regarding when our forefather Jacob brought delicacies to his father, wanting to intensify soul nourishment, represented by fragrance, the verse says, Jacob brought him wine, and he drank, Genesis 27:25, and only then. Isaac smelled the fragrance of his garments, for only by means of the wine was the song aroused, as in, song is only sung over wine, by means of which the fragrance was roused, which is soul nourishment. Section 18. Therefore, Ham did what he did while Noah was drunk. Ham represents the evil inclination, the filth of the serpent that seeks to overpower, specifically during drunkenness, when the imagination is confused, which itself is the filth of the serpent, for that is from where it gets its main nourishment. Therefore, when Noah awoke from his wine, he realized what his youngest son had done to him and understood his full intention and how far it reached, for the ultimate goal of the forces of evil is to intensify the filth of the serpent, the confusion of the imagination, which confuses the holy faith, so that it will be able to overpower the land of Israel, which corresponds to faith in the renewal of the world. And therefore, the land of Israel was indeed under the rule of Canaan, the descendants of Ham, for many years. Thus, when Noah understood all this, as in, he understood what his youngest son had done to him, he cursed him by saying, "Cursed is Canaan. He shall be a slave's slave to his brothers," specifically, a slave representing the overpowering of sleep that comes from a confused imagination, as in, 10 measures of sleep descended to the world. Slaves received 9 of them. Kiddushin 59b. In other words, Noah cursed him with that which he had blemished, that he should fall into slavery, which corresponds to sleep, to the confusion of the imagination that is drawn from the filth of the serpent who was cursed. Cursed are you. Genesis 3:14, corresponding to, cursed is Canaan, as stated in the Holy Zohar, Part 1, 73b, that both are one concept. This is the meaning of, blessed is God, the God of Shem. May Canaan be a slave to him. Blessed is God, the God of Shem, from whom descended the Jewish people, who always unify his name and reveal his godliness and believe in the renewal of the world, which is the essence of the holiness of the land of Israel, and therefore they deserve to receive the land of Israel. Thus, may Canaan be a slave to him, meaning that Canaan should be submissive and humbled before them. Noah was prophesying that the Israelites, descendants of Shem, would conquer the land of Israel from the hands of Canaan, and Canaan would fall before them and become their slaves. All this was the opposite of Canaan's intention in wanting to intensify the confused imagination in order to overpower the holiness of the land of Israel, which corresponds to faith in the renewal of the world that is drawn from the refining of the imagination. Therefore, he cursed him in what he had blemished, that the filth should cleave to him, the slavery and the sleep, while the Israelites would conquer the land of Israel from his hands and reveal his godliness to all mankind, as in, blessed is God, the God of Shem, upon which Rashi comments that God will fulfill his promise to Shem's descendants to give them the land of Canaan. This is because the land of Israel corresponds to the refining of the imagination, which is the opposite of the filth of Ham and Canaan, who correspond to slavery and oversleep that comes from the confusion of the imagination. In other words, he prophesied that evil plan of Ham, who embodied the evil inclination and the forces of evil, would not be realized, for the Israelites with Moses' power will conquer the land of Israel and reveal the holy faith to all mankind. Section 19. This corresponds to the 10 knots on each of the Tzitzit, corresponding to the 10 commandments, corresponding to the 10 levels of prophecy, which is the refining of the imagination by means of which garments are rectified, which is the essence of Tzitzit. Section 20. This is what is stated in the Zohar and Kabbalistic texts that Tzitzit parallel the Pesuki de Zimra, chapters of Psalms, recited in the morning prayers. It is explained there how to rectify and elevate the 4 worlds in action and word, and Tzitzit correspond to the world of formation, which corresponds to the Pesuki de Zimra. For Tzitzit correspond to the thread of loving kindness, upon which the song and melody of the future will be played, which is the source of all melodies and songs, represented by the Pesuki de Zimra. Section 21. Therefore, there are 4 Tzitzit corresponding to the 4 letters of the divine name, YHVH, which represents the single, double, triple, and quadruple song that is numerically 72, which represents the song of the future, which corresponds to the thread of loving kindness, which corresponds to the strands of the Tzitzit. The mitzvah of Tzitzit also directly represents single, double, triple, and quadruple. We first take 4 individual strands, corresponding to the single song, and pass them through the hole in the corner and double them, corresponding to the double song. Then we knot them and braid them so that they are tripled, as in a 3rd braid and 2/3 strands, corresponding to the triple song. Then we do the same at all 4 corners, and by means of the tzitzit at the 4 corners, we evoke the quadruple song. Hence, the mitzvah of tzitzit alludes to the single, double, triple, and quadruple song, which is the source of the tzitzit. Section 22. This corresponds to the 39 windings, which are numerically the divine name YHVH times 1, meaning God is one. For the essence of tzitzit is to evoke perfect faith, represented by God is one. For that is the essence of the faith. And as brought in the Likutey Zohar, that the tzitzit represent faith in the oneness, represented by, Hear, O Israel, God is one. Section 23. Therefore, tzitzit are 32 strands, representing the totality of the Torah, which begins with the letter Beit and concludes with the letter Lamed. For the tzitzit correspond to faith, which is the totality of the Torah, from Bereshit till Leinei Kol Israel. That is why the Torah begins with, In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, to declare that the essential beginning and the fundamental fulfillment of the entire Torah is through faith in the renewal of the world. In that we believe that God created the heavens and the earth from absolute nothingness, which is the foundation of the entire Torah, as in Habakkuk came and established it on one thing. A tzaddik lives by his faith. Habakkuk 2:4, Makot 24, A as in, all your commandments are faith. Psalms 119:86. We are able to attain this through tzitzit, and therefore they are 32 strands corresponding to the totality of the Torah from the Beit of Breshit till the Lamed of Leinei Kol Yisrael. Section 24. We have explained above that by means of tzitzit we evoke the good rebuke of the worthy rebuker. This corresponds to, He is for you a covering for the eyes, and for everyone you will have a rebuke. Genesis 20:16. A covering for the eyes represents the tzitzit, which rectify garments and coverings, as in, for it alone is his covering. This refers to the tzitzit, Likutey Zohar 22a. Thus, specifically, a cover for the eyes, for the tzitzit correspond to the eyes, for which reason they are called tzitzit, as in, peeking through the cracks. Song of Songs 2:9, as Rashi explains in the Torah section of Tzitzit, and as the Rebbe explains elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1:7. This is the meaning of, He is for you a covering for the eyes, which is the tzitzit, as said, by means of which we attain the good rebuke of the worthy rebuker. And this is the meaning of, to Sarah he said, Look, I have given 1,000 silvers to your brother. It is for you a covering for the eyes. Sarah's being taken to the house of Pharaoh and the house of Avimelech is the mystery of the prayer of the powerful tzaddik as judgment. The forces of evil seek to swallow it, but through the great power of the powerful tzaddik by means of his prayer, it gets stuck in its throat and is forced to vomit all the life force that it swallowed from holiness, as in, it swallowed vitality and shall vomit it. God will cast it out of its belly. Job 20:15. This corresponds to the taking of Sarah to the houses of Pharaoh and of Abimelech, which were places of the forces of evil that sought to possess themselves the God-fearing woman, corresponding to prayer, by means of sexual lust, which is drawn from the filth of the serpent that was in control of them. They wanted to control the righteous Sarah and defile her with filth. But Sarah was such a great tzadikah, and so spiritually powerful, that even when judgments had overtaken her, and she was taken to their houses, she nevertheless overpowered them with her great power, and they were unable to rule over her at all. On the contrary, She ruled over them and brought upon them heavy plagues. As written, God struck. She extracted from them many holy sparks that they had previously swallowed. As in, when one person controls another to his own detriment. Ecclesiastes 8:9. All this corresponds to the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, which is exactly what the forces of evil seek to swallow. But through the great power of the powerful tzaddik, they are unable to nourish from it, and on the contrary, all the sparks of holiness are extracted from them. For prayer corresponds to a God-fearing woman, as written, a God-fearing woman will be praised. Proverbs 31:30, which refers to Sarah's being taken to Pharaoh's house. As explained elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 62. Through this, Sarah extracted all the sparks of holiness, as in, give her from the fruit of her hands. This is the meaning of, I have given 1,000 silvers to your brother. This represents the sparks of holiness that the forces of evil were forced to give back and return to holiness, giving to Abraham silver, possessions, and a large fortune. All this corresponds to the sparks of holiness that they were forced to vomit out and to nourish holiness, specifically by their having tried to take control of Sarah, who corresponds to the prayer of the powerful tzaddik who extracts all the sparks of holiness from the forces of evil. This connects and explains the verse well from beginning to end. At first glance, the verse does not make any sense at all. What is the connection between a covering for the eyes and the 1,000 silvers? Rashi offers a very far-fetched interpretation on this, but according to what we have now said, the connection is explained very well. By means of the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, holiness is extracted from the forces of evil, as represented in the story of Sarah's being taken to Avimelech's house, by means of which she extracted all the sparks of holiness from there, by means of which the thread of loving kindness, which is the Tzitzit, is attained, by means of which one is able to rebuke. Thus, to Sarah he said, I have given 1,000 silvers to your brother. I have been forced to give up the sparks of holiness embodied in the silver and gold, as explained in Likutey Moharan Part 1, 56, and to return them to holiness, to Abraham. It is for you a covering for the eyes. This is Tzitzit, for this evokes the thread of loving kindness, corresponding to Tzitzit. And for everyone you will have a rebuke, for by this means good rebuke, corresponding to the rebuke of Moses, is attained. Section 25. This corresponds to, the city of Shushan was exultant and joyous, and Mordecai left the king's presence in a royal garment of tekales, and white Esther 8:15. Mordecai's greatness, which was the great and awesome miracle of Purim, came about through the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, by means of which we subdue Amalek, embodied by Haman, as explained in the lesson, which corresponds to the splitting of the Red Sea and the battle with Amalek. Therefore, the main miracle came about through Esther's being taken to the king's house. For Esther's being taken to Ahasuerus' house corresponds to the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, corresponding to the taking of Sarah to the houses of Avimelech and Pharaoh. The difference was only that with Sarah it was only very temporarily, for the judgment was not as great as in the times of Ahasuerus, when Haman, Amalek, the very embodiment of the filth of the serpent, rose up against us, and against which God himself fights at all times, for Israel's sake. As written, God will battle with Amalek from generation to generation. Exodus 17:16. But since the judgment was so intense, because the filth of the serpent, Haman himself, had attained such power, Esther was forced to be taken into the king's house, though he too did not touch her, as brought in the tikkunim. And with her great power, she extracted from the forces of evil all of the holy sparks, until the forces of evil, Haman and his family, were utterly subdued, and all his fortune was given to Mordecai. All this took place through the righteous Queen Esther, as written, Esther placed Mordecai over Haman's house. Esther 8:2, by means of which all the holy sparks that had been clothed in the wealth that had been under Haman's control were all elevated and returned to holiness to Mordecai. This in turn was brought about by means of the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, which gets stuck in the throat of the forces of evil, which brought about Haman's fall. This is the parallel between Esther's being taken to the king's house to the story of Sarah. Therefore, the miracle took place through sleeplessness. As written, on that night, the king's sleep eluded him. Ibid 6:1. The miracle began at this point. Insomnia represents a refining of the imagination. For when the imagination is refined well, there is no need to sleep, for sleep is essentially to refine the imagination. But when the imagination is refined, no sleep is needed. And by means of prayer as judgment, as in the story of Esther in the house of Ahasuerus, the imagination becomes refined, as explained in the lesson. Therefore, this brought about sleeplessness, which is a result of the refining of the imagination. And this brought about the great miracle, for the essence of the miracle of Purim is the subdual of Amalek, who represents the essence of atheism and heresy, as explained elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 2, 19, and the revelation of faith in the renewal of the world, as explained by the Rebbe on the verse, his hands were faith, Exodus 17:12, which refers to the battle with Amalek. For Amalek's fall is mainly by means of revealing the holy faith. Therefore, the downfall of Haman Amalek was mainly through sleeplessness, corresponding to the refining of the imagination, by means of which the holy faith is revealed, which is the main element in the downfall of Amalek and Haman, as said, by means of which we attain the light of the Tzitzit, as said. This is the meaning of Mordecai left the king's presence in a royal garment of tesheles. This represents Tzitzit, which have tesheles, which are the essential rectification and splendor of all garments of honor. In other words, the light of the Tzitzit, represented by the royal garment of tekeils and white, manifested then upon Mordecai, for by means of prayer as judgment, Haman had his downfall, and the holy faith was revealed, thus attaining the thread of loving kindness, which corresponds to the light of the Tzitzit, which corresponds to the royal garment of tekeils and white. This is the meaning of, the Jews had light and joy, and the city of Shushan was exultant and joyful, representing the intensity of the joy of Purim. Joy is evoked mainly by the thread of loving kindness, corresponding to the royal garment of tekeils, which represents the Tzitzit, for the thread of loving kindness corresponds to the melody of the future, which is the source of all joys. Therefore our sages said, a thread of loving kindness was drawn upon Esther, Megillah 13a, for she had attained this thread. Section 26. This is represented by the feast of Purim, when it is a mitzvah to eat a lot at the meal. By means of the thread of loving kindness, eating is rectified to be sacred, for we are able to make our eating into soul nourishment by means of the fragrance that is evoked by the melody, which corresponds to the thread of loving kindness. This corresponds to Mordecai. He is called Mordecai to represent free-flowing myrrh, which is the choice of all spices and fragrances. As written, take for yourself choice spices. Free-flowing myrrh. Exodus 30:23. Similarly, Esther's real name was Hadassah, representing the myrtle leaf that gives off fragrance, for they both had evoked the thread of loving kindness, the voice of the melody that waters the garden, the source of all fragrances. And by means of the voice that waters the garden, Haman Amalek, the filth of the serpent, corresponding to the heel of Esau, was subdued. As our sages said, where is Haman alluded to in the Torah? From the tree of knowledge, Chulin 139b. Hence, Haman is the essence of the filth of the serpent that is evoked by eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and his subdual and downfall is brought about by the voice that waters the garden. This corresponds to the proximity of the verse, I heard your voice in the garden and feared, to the verse. from the tree. I heard your voice, which corresponds to this voice, rectifies the eating of the tree of knowledge, which brings about the downfall of Haman, who represents physical nourishment, and Abba. And we attain soul nourishment, which is evoked by this voice, the source of all fragrances, which are evoked by Mordecai and Esther Hadassah, whose names mean fragrance. Section 27. This corresponds to many of the masses were converting to Judaism, Esther 8:17. For conversions are brought about by the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, as stated in the lesson. Section 28. Therefore, converts come under the wings of the Shekhinah, represented by the wings of mitzvah, which are the Tzitzit. For Tzitzit correspond to the thread of loving kindness that is evoked by the prayer of the powerful tzaddik, which causes conversions, as explained in the lesson. Section 29. This corresponds to the sequence of the entire Torah section of Shlach, in which the section of Tzitzit appears. The spies had caused a blemish in the land of Israel, which corresponds to the renewal of the world, the source of the melody. But Moses, in his great power, brought about God's forgiveness. As written there, God said, I have forgiven, as you say. The melody was thus re-evoked, corresponding to, my spikenard gave off its fragrance, corresponding to the forgiving of sins. Therefore, the section of libations comes immediately after this, for the wine libations over the sacrificial offerings is the main time for song, as in, song is only sung over wine, corresponding to the evoking of the song and the melody that goes specifically with wine, corresponding to the rectification and refining of the imagination, corresponding to the wine that gladdens. Therefore, immediately after this comes the section of challah, a choice part of dough set aside as a tithe, which represents the entering into the land of Israel, as written, when you enter the land. Numbers 15:18 through 21. For the people became obligated in challah as soon as they entered the land of Israel, as Rashi explains there. This is because this melody is evoked mainly by the land of Israel, which represents the rectification of food in order to subdue physical nourishment, which is represented by challah, in order to rectify food, to rectify the sin of Adam, whose sin was in eating and intensifying the need for physical nourishment. This is rectified by challah, which became obligatory specifically upon entering the land of Israel, the source of the melody, as our sages said. Eve damaged the challah of the world, who was Adam, God's choice dough. Therefore, she will have to set aside challah tanchuma, Noah, number 1. Hence, challah rectifies Adam's sin, the sin of blemished eating, of physical nourishment. For by setting aside challah, our bread, our food, becomes soul nourishment, as the tzaddikim eat, as in, a tzaddik eats to his soul's fill, Proverbs 13:25. Therefore, the section of the offering for the sin of idolatry comes after this, which is the rectification of a blemish in faith, for the melody is evoked by the rectification of the holy faith. Then comes the section of the man who gathered wood on the Shabbat, which deals with the sanctity of the Shabbat, which contains all holy days, all of which evoke the holy faith. And finally comes the section of Tzitzit, for all this is included in the mitzvah of Tzitzit. This is what the Rebbe wrote, the acronym of Vayomer YHVH Salachti Kidvarecha. God said, I have forgiven, as you say is my cup. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 177. For the tzaddikim are able to bring about the forgiveness of sins with their drinking wine. For the tzaddik evokes a rectification and refining of the imagination with his drinking wine, which evokes the melody, which evokes the forgiving of sins. Therefore, the section of wine libations comes after this verse. Tzitzit Law 6 is included in washing the hands in the morning, Law 4. Law 7. Tzitzit can be understood with Likutey Halakhot, Part 2:8. Section 1. We have already shed some light on Tzitzit with this lesson in the Laws of Tzitzit number 5, also explaining there with this lesson about arousal from sleep and rising at midnight. We repeat here what is relevant to the N0EW insights presented here, specifically that Tzitzit correspond to the thread of loving kindness that is evoked by the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik. After further study, I have found with God's help several more insights regarding Tzitzit from this lesson. Section 2. It is explained in this lesson, in paragraph 6, that the rectifications achieved by the prayer as judgment corresponds to the healing that is evoked by the forgiving of sin that is attained by the perfect prayer of the Holy Assembly of Israel that has been increased by new members. By means of the addition of new members who pray together with the assembly, the holy houses of prayer are exponentially increased. 3 stones can be arranged to form 6 different houses, 4 to form 24, 5 to form 120, and so forth, till we reach numbers for which we have no names. See there well in the lesson what the Rebbe has written regarding the verse, "Let no neighbor say, I am ill." Isaiah 33:24. Hence, prayer with additional members that houses exponentially corresponds to the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, as can be understood from there to one who studies it. Let us explain this a bit. It is explained there that by means of the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, he extracts from the forces of evil all the knowledge, prayers, sparks of holiness and souls that the forces of evil had previously swallowed, as in, he swallowed vitality and vomits it. Job 20:15. Thus we can say that these souls which this powerful tzaddik has extracted from the forces of evil are the souls that have been added to the holy assembly, by means of which the houses of holiness are exponentially increased. Initially, when these souls had been swallowed by the forces of evil, they were certainly distant from prayer. But now that the powerful tzaddik has extracted them from the forces of evil, they are now close to holiness, are added to the holy assembly of Israel that is involved in prayer with devotion, and become neighbors to them. This increases the number of houses exponentially, and eventually all of the remaining souls that have become extremely distant, corresponding to holy stones have been cast aside at every street top. Lamentations 4:1 can enter and be gathered into these houses. All this corresponds to tzitzit, for tzitzit correspond to the ingathering of the dispersed, as in, I shall gather in the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Isaiah 11:12, for which reason we gather the tzitzit in our hands when we recite, "Bring us peacefully from the 4 corners of the earth," the blessing preceding Kriyat Shema. This is because the commandment of tzitzit is evoked by the powerful tzaddik who is able to pray as judgment, by means of which he evokes all the rectifications mentioned there, which itself corresponds to prayer, with the addition of new members. This is because the tzitzit gather in the dispersed from the 4 corners of the earth, which itself corresponds to prayer, with many additional members, by means of which all the dispersed are gathered into this profusion of houses that comes about by means of the new members, as in, God builds Jerusalem. He gathers in Israel's dispersed. Psalms 147:1, for all the dispersed are gathered into these houses, from which the holy city of Jerusalem is built. Section 3. By means of the ingathering of these souls to holiness, holy garments are made, as in, lift up your eyes and look around. They have all been gathered and have come to you. As I live, says God, you shall wear them all as an adornment. Isaiah 64. This represents the tzitzit, which gather in the dispersed, which are the essence of holy garments. This is the meaning of, be roused, don your might, O Zion. Ibid 52:1. The holy garments, which correspond to tzitzit, are made by the staff of might, which is the prayer as judgment of the powerful tzaddik, which itself corresponds to prayer with additional members, by means of which the dispersed are gathered in, which corresponds to Tzitzit. Therefore, our sages in fact said on the verse, 10 men from all of the 70 nations will grab onto the corner of the garment of a Jewish person, Zechariah 8:23, that by means of fulfilling the mitzvah of Tzitzit, people from all of the 70 nations will attach themselves to the Jew and through him come close to God. This is because Tzitzit correspond to the ingathering of the dispersed, which corresponds to the souls of the repentant and the converts who will be attracted by means of prayer as judgment. As stated in the lesson on the verse, God will cast it out of its belly, Job 20:15. This explains why this verse, 10 men, etc., comes after the previous verses that speak about converts being added to the assembly of Israel to pray together with them. Nations will come. The residents of one city will go to those of another and say, "Let us go appeal to God and beseech him. I too will go," immediately, after which comes, in those days when 10 men, as said, the addition of converts, of new members to the Holy Assembly, to pray and appeal with them to God, corresponds to Tzitzit, which corresponds to, from all the nations of the world will grab onto the corner. This explains the juxtaposition of the verses. Section 4. See what I have written in the Laws of Propagation number 6, based on this awesome concept of additional members in the Holy Assembly, especially paragraphs 12 and 13. It is explained there that in this way it is possible to fulfill the many covenants that are incumbent upon every Jewish individual. 48 covenants were struck over each and every commandment, as explained in Sotah 37b, where it is concluded that every single Jew obligated himself as a guarantor for each of the other 600,000 Jews. This means that each Jew is responsible for hundreds of thousands of covenants, and, according to one opinion there, each of the guarantors is obligated for all of the guarantor responsibilities of each of the other guarantors. In the Laws of Propagation, we explain that it is possible to fulfill one's responsibilities for all of these guarantor debts by bringing a soul, a new member, into the Holy Assembly, by means of which the houses are exponentially increased, far exceeding the above number of covenants. All this can be attained by means of the Tzitzit, which represent the ingathering of the dispersed, corresponding to the addition of members. This corresponds to the 4 strands of Tzitzit on each corner of the garment, which are doubled to become 8. Each of these strands must be made of at least 2 threads, bringing it to 16. All this corresponds to the covenants, as explained there in the Talmud. The blessings and curses on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal are generalities, referring to the entire Torah as one, and specifics, referring to each individual commandment. 4 covenants for each of: to study, to teach, to observe, and to fulfill, is 4 plus 4 equals 8, and 8 plus 8 equals 16. These 16 covenants were also struck at Mount Sinai and again in Moab desert, altogether 48. All this is alluded to in the commandment of Tzitzit, which corresponds to the ingathering of the dispersed from the 4 corners of the earth by means of gathering the 4 Tzitzit from the 4 corners of the Talit. Each of the Tzitzit alludes to these covenants. First, there are 4, the 4 strands of the Tzitzit. The 4 then are doubled, and 4 plus 4 equals 8. And since each of the 8 strands are made of 2 threads, 8 plus 8 equals 16. The Tzitzit also have several aspects of triplicities. They must be 1/3 braided and 2/3 singular strands. Each section of braiding must be at least 3 windings, and they must be hung within 3 finger breadths of the edge of the garment. All this corresponds to our sages saying that the 16 covenants were made 3 times. Hence, the 48 covenants over each and every commandment represents 16 tripled covenants, which corresponds to the Tzitzit, which are 16 and tripled in several ways. This corresponds to the numerical value of the word for Tzitzit, which is 600, corresponding to the 600,000 Jewish souls as stated in Kabbalistic texts. Adding the 8 strands and the 5 knots brings to a total of 613, corresponding to the 613 commandments, as our sages said Menashot 43b, Rashi there. All this corresponds to the above-mentioned guarantees. Each individual Jew took upon himself covenantal responsibility for the fulfillment of the 613 commandments by the 603,550 Israelites, which must be multiplied by another 48 times for the blessings and curses, all of which must be multiplied again by another 603,550, according to the opinion that guarantee for guarantors was also taken on. See what else we have said there about this in the laws of propagation. It is impossible to fulfill all these obligations other than by the addition of new members corresponding to the ingathering of the dispersed, which is accomplished by means of the holy Tzitzit. Therefore, Tzitzit are numerically 613, as said, corresponding to the 613 commandments, and also to the 603,550 Jewish souls, which also are numerically 613. 3,550 equals 13. 3 plus 5 plus 5, and 600,000 equals 600, together 613. This is because the 613 commandments, which are the totality of the Torah, correspond to the totality of Jewish souls which are rooted in the Torah, as known. All this is embodied in the commandment of Tzitzit, which is numerically 613, corresponding to all of the above, for they embody all of the above covenants that are 4 plus 4, 8 plus 8, and so forth, tripled, and numerically 613, thus embodying all of the myriads upon myriads of covenants that are fulfilled by the addition of new members, corresponding to the ingathering of the dispersed from the 4 corners of the earth that is achieved by the commandment of Tzitzit. Section 5. This corresponds to the Talit Katan and the Talit Gadol. At the beginning of the day, one dons the Talit Katan in one's home. This is for oneself, to achieve by means of these Tzitzit of the Talit Katan, to bind oneself to God, to His holy Torah, and to all Jewish souls, which is the essence of the mitzvah of Tzitzit, as written, "You shall see it, and remember all of God's commandments." Numbers 15:39. Through this, one is enabled to become a member of the Holy Assembly of Israel, which gathers every day in the synagogues and study halls in order to unify His name and pray to Him, as is appropriate. Afterward, one goes to the synagogue or study hall and actually becomes a member of the assembly, by means of which he is then able to wrap himself in the Talit Gadol that is worn there for prayer, for then, together with the collective of the Holy Assembly, one arouses those who are very distant from his service, which corresponds to the ingathering of the dispersed from the 4 corners of the earth, which is represented by our gathering the Tzitzit in our hands while reciting the prayer, "Bring us peacefully." In other words, initially, with the Talit Katan, we bring ourselves close to the Holy Assembly so that we may have the privilege of being added to it as a good member. And then in the synagogue, after one has already become a member there, one is able to gather and bring close other distant ones so that they too become members, by means of which we fulfill our obligation of guarantors, fulfilling our obligation to study, to teach, to observe, and to fulfill. All this is accomplished by means of the Talit Gadol that we wrap ourselves in during prayers in the synagogue, which is the main time for gathering the dispersed, as in, "Bring us peacefully from the 4 corners of the earth," when we gather the Tzitzit of the Talit Gadol. Section 6. This is the meaning of telling you, "To you I will give the land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance." Psalms 105. 11. The essence of the ingathering of all of the dispersed is to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem, as written, "If your dispersed will be at the edge of the heaven, from there will God gather them and bring them to the good land." Deuteronomy 34-5. And similarly, we pray every day, gather us together from the four corners of the earth to our land. And the pinnacle of this is to come to Jerusalem, whose rebuilding corresponds to the above-mentioned profusion of houses, and to where all the dispersed will gather, as in God builds Jerusalem, he will gather Israel's dispersed. Psalms 147:2. This ingathering is accomplished mainly by means of the Tzitzit, for the Tzitzit are braided and woven, which represents the rope of holiness, as in, Jacob is the rope of his inheritance. For the Tzitzit embody all of the 613 commandments which correspond to the totality of Jewish souls, as said. This is the meaning of, telling you, to you I will give the land of Canaan as the rope of your inheritance. Specifically, the rope for the portion of the inheritance of the land of Israel was given to Jacob, the portion of his inheritance, by means of the mitzvah of Tzitzit, which represents the rope and bonds of holiness, by means of which everyone is gathered to the land of Israel, as in, gather us peacefully from the four corners of the earth, and bring us swiftly to our land, standing upright, at which point we take hold of the Tzitzit. Section 7. Thus Korach was considered a troublesome member, about whom our sages said, woe to the wicked person, woe to his neighbor. Numbers Rabbah 18:5. For he opposed Moses and his holy assembly, and wanted to withdraw from it, as in Korach took, translated by the Targum as Korach separated himself, and thus caused a great blemish in the wondrous rectification accomplished by the addition of members to the assembly. This explains why he chose to express this specifically by exhibiting flawed tzitzit, by donning a talit that was completely dyed with Tekil's ibid. For his withdrawing from the community negated the rectification of the tzitzit, which is to add good members to the holy assembly, to bond together the holy rope of Israel. But since he damaged this, he therefore opposed specifically the mitzvah of tzitzit. Section 8. This corresponds to the Torah section of Shkalim. When you count the heads of Israel, Exodus 30:12. On the surface, this seems strange, since counting the Israelites is dangerous, for it may evoke a plague upon them, as our sages said Rashi there. So why did God command to count them but to give Shkalim as an atonement? If they are not counted, they will not need an atonement. The commentators have already sensed this difficulty, but the ultimate answer is that the essence of the census of Israel corresponds to the above. That is, prayer is exponentially increased by the addition of one soul to another by the census, by means of which the holy houses are exponentially increased. Therefore, God warned to count them specifically by means of shkalim, rather than count them by heads, so that no plague will befall them as a result of the census. For the people of Israel are a holy people that is beyond counting, since they are all unified in the source of oneness, as written, you are one, and your name is one. And who is like your people? Israel, one nation on earth. Tikkunei, Zohar 34a. Census and counting are relevant for the non-Jewish nations, who are in the category of multiplicity, as in, they seek many accountings, Ecclesiastes 7:29. And as Rashi explains there, Esau's tribe was only 6 souls, yet they are referred to in the plural, whereas Jacob's tribe was 70 souls, yet they are referred to in the singular. But the truth is that the very fact that the souls of Israel are all considered one soul, the Jewish people should therefore multiply like the sand of the sea, for the more the Jewish people multiply, the more God's glory and name are increased, as in, a king's splendor is in a multitude of people. Proverbs 14:28. And they are all the more unified in his oneness. For this reason, God commanded to count them in order to reveal the multitude of Israelite souls, over 600,000, in order to increase his name and glory, so as to publicize and declare his might to mankind. in that there are over 600,000 souls who unify His name at all times and are unified within His oneness. However, as soon as the Israelites are counted, the evil forces are able to accuse and attack, for multiplicity and counting is within their sphere of influence, as in, they sought many accountings. They will argue, "Why are you priding yourselves in your numbers? We are manifold greater than you." For each and every nation, on its own, is greater than the census of Israel, as written, "You are the smallest of all the peoples." Deuteronomy 7:7. There is therefore a concern that they will overpower Israel by means of their multitude and counter Israel's numbers. As a result, they may raise accusations against Israel and cause a plague, representing death, which is their dominion upon Israel. Therefore, God commanded to count Israel only by means of the shkalim, as an atonement to be given toward the building of the sanctuary, which is the house of prayer, as in, "For my house is a house of prayer," Isaiah 56:7. Furthermore, the shkalim were mainly given for the 100 sockets to support the columns of the sanctuary, which correspond to the 100 blessings, as brought in Kabbalistic texts, which represent the totality of prayer. In other words, by counting them with the shkalim that are given for erecting the sanctuary, which represents erecting prayer, for all of the countless houses that are built by the addition of Jewish souls are all embodied within the sanctuary and the temple, which embodies all houses of prayer. The census thereby brings about a most wondrous rectification. The forces of evil are thereby unable to attack, accuse, and overpower the Jewish people with their more numerous simple numbers than Israel. For now, by means of the shkalim that were given for the sanctuary, which is the house of prayer, all of the Jewish souls are unified and combined into exponential numbers, for each additional soul multiplies the total exponentially, such that the total of 600,000 souls is beyond expression and comprehension. The 70 nations are all then obviously rendered completely insignificant compared to the numbers of the souls of Israel that combine exponentially by means of the shkalim that were given to rectify the houses of prayer. Therefore, they have no power to accuse, for all the multitudes of the non-Jewish nations are as nothing and naught compared to awesome multiplicity of Jewish houses, as in, "All of the nations are as nothing before Him. They are less than naught and desolation for Him." Isaiah 40:17. This is because the nations of the world are in the category of the world of separation and have no unification or combination at all, which is why they are called many souls. Israel, however, is one people, and the more they increase, they unify and combine exponentially, and become unified ever more greatly in the source of oneness, the source of life. As written, "With you is the source of life." Psalms 36:10. This spares them from the dominion of death, as in, "so that no plague befalls them when they are counted." Exodus 30:12. For the multiplicity of the non-Jewish nations cannot overpower the numbers of Israel, which are less than theirs. For by means of the exponential multiplications that are brought about by the shkalim that were given to build the houses of prayer, the multiplicity of the non-Jewish nations are rendered insignificant as nothing and naught. Section 9. Therefore, we must give specifically a half shekel and not a full shekel, to teach that each Jew needs to combine with another, for each one is only like a half and has no wholeness other than by combining with another, by means of which the exponential multiplications which rectify the census are brought about. Furthermore, the half shekel is worth 10 gera, since 1 shekel is worth 20 gera, because holiness cannot be evoked with less than 10, and each Jew embodies the 10 sanctities of the land of Israel, and correspond to no congregation is less than 10, Megillah 23b. Therefore, no declaration of holiness may be recited with less than 10 people, for holiness always has 10 aspects, as known, and that is the sanctity of the above-mentioned holy combinations. This is because the initial combinations of the houses of prayer must begin with at least 10, so that a declaration of holiness can be made. 4. The divine presence rests upon any 10 people. Sanhedrin 39a. Then, when another soul is added, and each one of them embodies 10, 10 must be multiplied by 10 for each combination of souls, which brings to exponential numbers. This is the power to exponentially combine the souls that gather to pray with intention, is by means of the 10 sanctities, which are the source of all holy combinations. This is represented by the half shekel, which is 10 gera, which must always be combined with another to make 20 gera for a shekel, which corresponds to each pan was 10 shekel, Numbers 786, as brought in the Kabbalistic texts, Zohar, Part 3, 258a. These are the 10 sanctities from above to below, and 10 from below to above. And by means of all these sanctities, the souls of Israel are unified and combined exponentially. All this is evoked by the power of the very powerful tzaddik, who prays prayer as judgment, which is the same as the prayer of the multitude of souls, as said above. This is alluded to in the mystery of the word for gerah, which is numerically the word for Isaac, which is numerically the word for laughter, as brought in Kabbalistic texts. Isaac represents harshness, which corresponds to prayer as judgment, which is mainly done on Rosh Hashanah, which corresponds to Isaac's awe, as stated in the lesson. This itself corresponds to Pinchas, for Pinchas represents the quintessential prayer as judgment, as in Pinchas rose and prayed and judged, as stated in the lesson. Section 10. This corresponds to what our sages said, that the Shkalim bring about Haman Amalek's downfall, for our shekels preceded his Megillah, 13b. The downfall of Haman Amalek is brought about mainly by means of prayer as judgment, which corresponds to the prayer of the multitude, as said, which corresponds to the rectification of the Shkalim, as stated in the lesson, by means of the staff of might, which corresponds to the splitting of the Red Sea, which corresponds to prayer as judgment, we are able to battle Amalek. Amalek's entire intention was to banish and distance from the holy assembly the weak souls of Israel, as in, he attacked all the stragglers behind you, and you were weary and faint. Deuteronomy 25:18. And as our sages said, Amalek attacked against those whom the cloud had expelled, Midrash Tanchuma, Tetzi, number 10. Therefore, he is subdued and conquered by prayer as judgment, by means of which we extract these souls from the forces of evil and add them to the holy assembly. All this is represented by Shkalim, and therefore his downfall came about through Shkalim. Section 11. This is why Esther specifically said, "Go and gather all the Jews." Esther 4:16, gather, and this word is used several times later in the story, such as to gather and to stand up for their souls, Ibid 8:11, and the Jews gathered, Ibid 9:2, and our sages said regarding Purim, and it is a time of gathering for all, Megillah 2a. This is because the essential miracle of Purim, which was the vanquishing of Haman Amalek, came about by means of the gathering and the assembly, for this increases the houses of prayer exponentially, so that all of the distant and dispersed ones are gathered in. All this was the opposite of Haman's evil plan, and therefore his great downfall came about in this way. This corresponds to Mordecai left the king's presence in a royal garment of tekeles. This represents the tekeles of the Tzitzit, which brings about the ingathering of the dispersed, which corresponds to prayer, which brings about the downfall of Haman Amalek. Therefore, when Haman wanted to overpower the Jewish people, he said, "There is a people which is scattered and divided among the nations," Ibid 3:8, stressing their being scattered and divided, and that it is impossible to gather them, on account of which he hoped to overpower them, for his downfall is by means of their gathering. Therefore, Esther said, "Go and gather all the Jews," specifically gather. Section 12. This is why it is a mitzvah to hear the Megillah in a large crowd, and the larger the better. Orach Chaim, number 690, the power of the miracle of Purim, which was the vanquishing of Haman Amalek, came about through the holy assembly of Israel, and therefore, the more people that gather together to hear the reading of the Megillah, which is the proclamation of the miracle, the more the miracle is publicized, and the more Haman Amalek has a greater downfall. And it is known that the essence of the reading of the Megillah and the proclamation of the miracle, and all of the commandments related to Purim, is to thereby vanquish the evil force of Haman Amalek in each and every generation, in each and every year, in each and every individual, as written explicitly in the Megillah. These days are remembered and observed in each and every generation, in each and every family, in each and every country, and in each and every city. Ibid 9:28. Therefore, it is a great mitzvah to make an effort to hear the Megillah in the largest assembly of Jews possible.